San Francisco, February 11th, 1976. A white delivery truck sits quietly on a calm neighborhood street in the Sunset District. Inside the truck, two men are sitting and waiting with shotguns in their hands. They are waiting for their target, the very first man who was ever put into the FBI's Special Witness Protection Program. This man had turned against the mob, told lies that sent people who did nothing wrong to death row, and believed he could run away from his past by hiding 3,000 miles away from Boston. He was completely wrong about that. This is the true story of Joseph the Animal Arbosa, a Portuguese hitman who became the scariest killer in all of New England. This is the man who actually bit off another man's cheek during a bar fight, and the FBI informant whose lies would cause one of the biggest scandals in the entire history of federal law enforcement. Before we jump into this amazing true story, I want to know where you are watching from right now. What time is it in your area? Leave a comment down below and tell me if you're listening to this while trying to fall asleep, while you're working, or if you're just really interested in true crime stories. And if you want more detailed gangster stories that go way deeper than what you usually hear, hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications. Trust me when I say this, you won't want to miss what happens next in this story. And give this video a thumbs up if you're ready to hear one of the most shocking mob stories you've ever heard in your entire life. Now, let's get started. September 20th, 1932. New Bedford, Massachusetts. The city is located on the southern coast of Massachusetts. It's a place that was built by the hard work of whaling ships and Portuguese fishermen, where the smell of the ocean mixes with the smell from fish processing plants, and the sounds of many different languages float through crowded apartment buildings. This is the place where Joseph Barboza comes into the world. He was born to Portuguese immigrant parents who came to America, hoping to find something better than what they had left behind in their home country. His father, Joseph Barbosa S.R., was a middleweight boxer who fought in small-time boxing matches all around New England. He would come home with bruised and cut-up knuckles and money that never seemed to be enough to support the family. His mother, Cometa Camille, worked as a seamstress, which means she sewed clothes for people. Her fingers would move quickly over fabric in small, cramped rooms, always trying to stretch every single dollar to buy food to feed her 4 children. Joseph had 2 brothers, whose names were Donald and Anthony, and he also had a sister. They all lived in a world where being poor wasn't just about not having money, but also about culture and where you came from. Being Portuguese in an Italian-controlled criminal underworld meant you were always standing on the outside looking in, never really belonging. Young Joe grew up watching his father's fists in action. He learned very early in life that violence could be used as a tool, as a weapon, as a possible way to escape poverty. The Great Depression was crushing New Bedford's Portuguese community really hard, and the Barboza family felt every single bit of that terrible pressure. Food was hard to find. Money was even harder to find than food. Respect was something you had to take by force, because nobody was ever going to just give it to you freely. The boy had dark-colored skin, and he was stocky and thick even when he was a child. He had a thick neck and a face that seemed to become hard and tough very early in his life. He spoke Portuguese when he was at home with his family, but when he was out on the streets, he picked up Italian and Spanish languages too. He absorbed languages the same way he absorbed lessons about how to survive in a tough world. School and education didn't work out for him. He would barely make it past 8th grade, and he remained functionally illiterate, which means he couldn't really read or write well for most of his life. But what he didn't have in book learning and education, he made up for in street smarts and an amazing ability to read people's emotions and intentions. He could sense weakness in others, and he knew exactly when to strike and attack. New Bedford's docks were really rough and dangerous places during the 1930s and 1940s. Longshoremen, which are workers who load and unload ships, worked brutal and exhausting hours for very little pay. Fishing boats would come and go constantly. There were bars on every single corner that served as second homes for men who were trying to forget their troubles and problems. Young Joe would watch all of this happening around him, soaking in and learning from the casual violence he saw. He watched the way arguments and disputes were settled with fists or knives, and he learned the unspoken codes and rules about respect and territory. But more than anything else in his life, Joe Barboza felt the painful sting of being different from everyone else. The Italian kids would call him a really mean word because of his dark skin and Portuguese heritage. In a world where having an Italian last name meant you could access the upper levels of organized crime, being Portuguese meant you could only be labor and muscle, never management. You could be the muscle and kill for them, but you could never sit at their table as an equal. You could do their dirty work, but you would never be fully accepted as one of them. That rejection and feeling of being left out would define Joseph Barboza's entire life from beginning to end. He would spend many decades trying to prove himself worthy and valuable to men who would never truly accept him no matter what he did. He would kill people on their orders and help build their criminal empires, all while being kept at arm's length because his blood and heritage weren't right in their eyes. And that painful rejection would eventually lead him to betray every single one of them. But that betrayal was still many years away in the future. For right now, he was just a young boy growing up in New Bedford, watching his boxer father fight, feeling the painful hunger in his belly and the burning rage in his chest, learning the hard lesson that in his world, violence was the currency and money that mattered most of all. April 18th, 1949, El Paso, Texas. A 16-year-old Joseph Arbosa steps into the boxing ring for his very first professional fight. He's using the ring name The Baron. The person he's fighting against is Rocky Lucero, and the crowd in the small venue where they're fighting is pretty sparse and thin. The lights are hot and harsh, beating down on the fighters. Barboza fights using what's called an orthodox stance, and when his fists connect and make contact with his opponent, they connect really hard with a lot of power. He's what boxing people call an outfighter, which means he's someone who uses raw power and strength over fancy finesse and technique. He wants to actually hurt his opponent badly, not just outpoint them on the judges' scorecards. He would end up fighting a total of 11 times over the next 12 years of his boxing career, winning 8 of those matches, with 5 of his wins coming by knockout. His very last fight would happen on September 23, 1961, when he fought against Doan Bale in Boston. But boxing, for all the violence and toughness it involved, was never going to be enough to satisfy Joseph Arbosa. The controlled environment of the ring, with all the rules you had to follow, and the referee who would stop things when they got too brutal and dangerous. None of that satisfied something deep inside him, because by the time he was fighting professionally and getting paid for it, Barboza had already discovered and learned that committing crimes paid way better money than legitimate and honest work ever would. At 18 years old in 1950, Joseph Barboza was sent to the Massachusetts Correctional Institution in Concord for 5 years. The specific details of the exact crime he committed are less important than what ended up happening next, because prison was the place where the animal truly began to emerge and show himself. May 1953, MC I Concord Barboza, who is just 20 years old at this time, organizes and plans what would become the largest and biggest prison break in the institution's entire 75-year history. The plan he comes up with is both simple and completely insane at the same time. He and 6 other inmates manage to get their hands on illegal whiskey and amphetamine pills, which are speed drugs. They spend an entire afternoon getting drunk on the whiskey and high on the drugs, working themselves up into a chemical-fueled fury and rage. And then they make their move and take action. 4 prison guards are overpowered and beaten. The violence happens quickly and brutally. Barboza isn't just trying to escape from prison. He's making a statement and showing everyone that walls and bars can't hold him in, that he can't be governed or controlled by anyone. They steal 2 cars and tear out of the prison grounds at high speed. 7 desperate men who are high on speed and drunk on whiskey, convinced that they're finally free. The escape ends up lasting barely 24 hours before it's over. They're caught, of course, just like you'd expect. Police all across Massachusetts are actively looking for them, and drunk. High prisoners aren't exactly master criminals who know what they're doing. They're all rounded up and brought back to prison, and Barboza's sentence gets extended and made longer as punishment. But something really important happened during those 24 hours of freedom that would change things. Word spread quickly throughout the criminal world about the kid who'd led the biggest prison break in MCI Concord's entire history. Stories spread about the kid who didn't just try to slip away quietly and hide, but instead went out in a huge blaze of violence and chaos that everyone noticed. Inside prison after he was brought back, Barboza's reputation became solid and established. He would punch and slug guards when they got too close to him. He threw tables during confrontations and fights. Other inmates learned pretty quickly to give him plenty of space and stay away from him. This wasn't someone who could be intimidated or scared, or controlled through normal means and methods. This was someone for whom violence was as natural and automatic as breathing air. But running parallel to his criminal life, Barboza kept boxing on the side. This duality and double life defined who he was by day. He was a legitimate athlete, using his fists within the rules of boxing. By night, he was a criminal who recognized and followed no rules at all. Both versions of Joseph Barboza were built on the exact same foundation, the strong belief that violence was the answer to every single problem he faced. When he wasn't locked up in prison, he was in the boxing ring. When he wasn't in the boxing ring fighting, he was committing crimes that would send him right back to prison again. It was a repeating cycle that would define most of his entire life. This constant inability to exist and function within the boundaries of normal society, this constant push against any form of restraint or control. His boxing career would finally end in 1961. But by that time, it didn't really matter anymore. Barboza had found his true calling and purpose, and it wasn't in legitimate athletics and sports. The criminal underworld was calling out to him, and Joseph Barboza was completely ready to answer that call. The nickname, The Animal, emerged and came about from Barboza's growing reputation for extreme, unpredictable, brutal violence. It was a reputation he actively encouraged and promoted through his actions. And later, he would exaggerate it even more in interviews with reporters. Stories circulated and spread through Boston's underworld criminal network. Many of these stories came originally from Barboza himself. He claimed that he bit off parts of opponents' ears or cheeks during bar fights, and then spit them out on the floor. Some stories even said he gnawed and chewed on a victim's skull fragment after a shooting incident. While these tales and stories became legend and terrified even experienced and seasoned criminals who'd seen everything. No police reports or independent witnesses have ever definitively confirmed and proven that the most extreme incidents actually happened. What is undisputed and definitely true is that Barboza's violence often seemed personal and excessive, going way beyond what was actually required or needed for his criminal work. Men who'd spent their entire lives around killings and beatings found him disturbing and unsettling. They found him scary, not just because of what he did, but because of how he appeared to really enjoy it and take pleasure in it. They started calling him the Animal, at first as a kind of dark joke among criminals. But the name stuck and stayed, because to them it fit him perfectly. This wasn't someone who used violence purely as a tool to get things done. This was someone for whom brutality seemed almost instinctive and automatic, a core part of his identity and who he was as a person, rather than just professional necessity for his job. By 1958, Barboza had been paroled and released from his prison sentence. He was 26 years old at this time. Stocky and muscular, with a thick neck and an angular, watermelon-shaped skull that made him instantly recognizable wherever he went. He moved through East Boston's organized crime circles, like a shark moves through water, smooth, predatory, always moving forward. He became a regular customer at a bar on the corner of Bennington Street and Brook Street, a place that local people would come to know simply as Barboza's Corner. Men would actually cross the street to avoid walking past it when they saw his car parked outside the bar. The bar became his office, his throne room, the place where people came to borrow money or pay back debts, or beg for more time to pay. Barboza built a crew of criminals around him. They were small-time criminals who recognized and understood that attaching themselves to the Animal meant protection and profit for them. The group included Joseph W. Amico, Patrick Fabiano, James Carnes, Arthur Bratsos, Thomas DePrisco, Joseph and Ronald Dermody, Carlton Eaton, Edward Goss, and Nicholas Femia. None of them were made men in the Mafia, which means they weren't officially inducted members. Most of them weren't even Italian by heritage, but under Barboza's protection, they operated with relative freedom and impunity, meaning they could get away with things, officially. Barboza was supervised and watched over by Stephen the Rifleman Flemmy, who worked for the Patriarca crime family. But that supervision was really just nominal at best, meaning it was supervision in name only. Barboza was too violent, too unpredictable to be controlled by anyone, no matter how powerful they were. He would never be officially inducted into the Mafia because of his non-Italian ancestry and heritage. That door was forever closed and locked to him no matter what he did. But he earned a reputation as one of Boston's most prolific contract killers, meaning he killed many people for money. The exact number of murders he committed may never be truly known. Barboza himself would later claim responsibility for 26 or even more murders. This is a figure that's widely cited and repeated, but it was never independently verified and proven. Law enforcement attributes fewer murders to him definitively, and with certainty. Some of the killings were contract hits, which means professional killings that were ordered by the Patriarca family as part of business. Other killings were personal, men who disrespected Barboza or failed to pay back their debts, or simply looked at him the wrong way on the wrong day at the wrong time. What made Barboza particularly valuable and useful to the mob was his willingness to do the work that even other hitmen and killers refused to do. Did they need someone killed in broad daylight in front of witnesses? Barboza would do it without hesitation. Did they need someone to suffer and be in pain before they died? Barboza would handle it personally. Did they need someone to simply disappear forever, where the body would never be found? Barboza had his methods and techniques, but even as he killed for the Italian mob over and over again, even as he proved his value and loyalty repeatedly, The acceptance and belonging he desperately craved never came to him. He was seen as useful muscle, a mad dog they could point at their enemies and unleash. But he would never be considered family by them. His Portuguese blood meant he would always be on the outside looking in, always be called that mean slur, always be something less than the made men he worked for and killed for. That rejection, that eternal outsider status, ate away at Barboza from the inside. He made more money than most made men in the organization. He was feared more than most made men. He'd killed more people than most made men had. But the ceremony, the official induction, the respect he desperately wanted and craved, it would never be his to have. And that painful rejection would eventually lead him to destroy them all and bring down their entire organization. By the early 1960s, Joseph Arbosa had found his most lucrative and profitable calling, loansharking. He started working for the mostly ethnic Irish Dudley Street crew around 1961, learning the business from men who'd been running loan operations for many years. But Barboza brought something completely new to the operation, a level of violence that transformed loansharking from a regular business into a reign of terror that scared everyone. In a 1970 interview with a reporter, Barboza would boast and brag about his success. He claimed he made $5,500 a week just on the VIG, which means the interest payments on cash loans, from just one single street corner in Boston. In 1960s dollars, that was extraordinary and amazing money. It's the equivalent of over $45,000 a week in today's modern currency and buying power. And that was just from one corner of the city. If you multiply that across multiple territories and areas, Joseph Barboza was pulling in hundreds of thousands of dollars every single year. But it wasn't just the money that motivated him and drove him forward. It was the power he had, the fear he inspired in people, the way men's faces would completely change when they saw him coming toward them. His system was brutally simple and straightforward. He'd lend money at exorbitant interest rates, which means extremely high interest, to desperate people who had nowhere else to turn. He loaned to gamblers who'd lost big at cards or dice, addicts who needed money for a fix, small business owners who were behind on their rent payments, family men who were just trying to keep their heads above water financially. The terms seemed reasonable and fair at first when you borrowed. Borrow $1,000, pay back $1,200, and you're done. But the VIG, the weekly interest, accumulated and piled up every single week, and if you missed even one payment, the total amount you owed could spiral completely out of control and become impossible to pay back. Barboza gave borrowers exactly 14 weeks to pay back their loans. 14 weeks to come up with the money somehow, to scrape together enough cash to clear their debt completely. After those 14 weeks passed, if they were still hiding from him, still avoiding payment and dodging him, he told the interviewer very matter-of-factly, "I'd stab guys, not threaten to stab them or send someone to rough them up a little bit. He would personally stab them himself with a knife." The terrifying and scary thing about Barboza's loansharking operation was its predictability. Everyone knew the rules clearly. Borrow money from him, pay it back on time, and you were completely fine and safe. Miss your payments and you'd get warnings at first. Hide from him for 14 weeks, and you'd get stabbed with a knife. The system was clear, almost bureaucratic in its violence, like a violent government office, but that clarity and predictability was exactly what made it so effective and successful. Men who borrowed money from other loan sharks might gamble and hope that they could negotiate for more time, that they could plead and beg for mercy, that they could reason with their creditor and work something out. With Barboza, There was absolutely no negotiation possible. The rules were the rules, and the consequences were guaranteed and certain. Stories circulated and spread through Boston about men who'd tried to hide from Barboza and failed. A plumber who'd borrowed money to cover a bad gambling debt made it 13 weeks before Barboza found him at his sister's house in Revere. The stabbing happened right in the kitchen in front of the sister and her children, who watched in horror. The plumber survived the attack, but paid his entire debt in full within just a few days, somehow finding money he'd claimed didn't exist and wasn't available. A small-time bookie tried to skip town entirely, taking a bus to Providence to stay with his cousins and lay low. Barboza found him in just 4 days. That man didn't survive the encounter. The message spread quickly throughout the criminal community. You can't hide from the animal. Geography and distance meant nothing to him. Excuses meant nothing. Family connections meant nothing. All that mattered was the debt you owed and the 14-week clock that was always ticking. Barboza drove a 1965 Oldsmobile Cutlass that he called his James Bond car after the famous spy movies. It was outfitted with a sophisticated alarm system that was cutting-edge and advanced for that era and time period. It also had a special device that could produce thick black smoke from the exhaust pipe, theoretically allowing him to escape from pursuers who were chasing him. The car was a symbol of both his success and his paranoia, his deep understanding that he'd made enough enemies over the years that eventually someone would come for him to get revenge. But in the mid-1960s, that threat still seemed distant and far away. Barboza was at the absolute height of his power during this time. He was collecting thousands of dollars every single week. He was feared all across New England. He was doing wet work, which means killings, for the Patriarca crime family. People who borrowed money from him were absolutely terrified of him. But desperate people always need money, no matter how dangerous the lender is. And Barboza was always there, willing to lend to them. His reputation for viciousness in collecting debts served another important purpose beyond just getting his money back. It made his job easier in the long run. Most borrowers paid back their loans specifically because they were too afraid not to pay. The actual violence, the stabbings and beatings, those were the exceptions, not the rule. They were demonstrations meant to maintain the entire system through fear and terror. For every single man Barboza stabbed with a knife, 100 other men paid their debts exactly on time, specifically to avoid being stabbed themselves. It was a perfect and self-sustaining criminal enterprise. High profit, low overhead costs, and it maintained itself through reputation and fear. And for a man like Joseph Arbosa, who seemed to need violence the way other men needed air to breathe, it provided him with regular opportunities to hurt people with a kind of moral justification in his mind. These weren't innocent victims he was hurting. They'd borrowed money and failed to pay it back on time. In Barboza's twisted mind, and in the twisted logic of the criminal underworld around him, that made the violence not just acceptable, but actually necessary and required. He was making more money than he'd ever imagined possible in his life. He was feared and respected throughout the region. His crew was loyal to him. The mob families were using him for their most important and difficult work. Everything seemed perfect, but in the criminal underworld, nothing stays perfect for very long. Raymond Patriarca sat at the very top and apex of New England organized crime, like a spider sits at the center of a vast web. From his modest office at the National Cigarette Service Company on Atwells Avenue in Providence, Rhode Island, he controlled gambling operations, loan sharking businesses, and various other rackets throughout Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and parts of New Hampshire and Maine. He was one of the most significant and important organized crime figures in 1960s America. He was a boss who'd survived multiple attempts on his life and numerous federal investigations to build an empire that generated millions of dollars every single year. And Joseph the Animal Barboza was one of his most valuable assets and tools. Barboza worked as an enforcer and hitman for the Patriarca family. He was officially supervised by Stephen, the rifleman, Fleming, but he operated with a degree of autonomy and independence that was unusual for someone who wasn't a made member of the organization. The body count attributed to Barboza, a figure of 26 murders, though the true number was likely even higher, was integral and essential to the Patriarca family's ability to dominate and control their territory. During the brutal mob wars of the 1960s, this was an era and time period of extraordinary violence in Boston's underworld. Different factions and groups fought for control of lucrative territories and profitable areas. The Irish Winter Hill Gang clashed and fought with the McLaughlin brothers. The Italian Mafia families maneuvered and plotted against each other and against non-Italian crews. Bodies turned up regularly in car trunks, in back alleys, and floating in Boston Harbor. Men would go out to buy cigarettes and never come home to their families. Wives became widows overnight. Children lost their fathers suddenly. Joseph Arbosa thrived and succeeded in this violent environment. He aligned himself with the Winter Hill Gang because James Buddy McLean was an ally of Vincent Fleming, who was Stephen's brother. This alliance put Barboza on one side of Boston's bloodiest and most violent gang war, pitting him against the McLaughlin brothers and all of their associates. Between 1965 and 1966, Barboza was involved in the murders of Edward Punchy McLaughlin, Cornelius Hughes, and Stevie Hughes, among many others. Each killing added to his growing reputation. Each successful hit proved his value to the Patriarca organization. He wasn't just willing to kill. Plenty of men in the mob were willing to kill when needed. Barboza was skilled at killing, creative with his methods, and untroubled by it in ways that even hardened and experienced criminals found disturbing and unsettling. But there were signs and warnings that Barboza's position wasn't as secure as it seemed on the surface. Two of his closest associates, Arthur Brazos and Thomas DePrisco, went out to raise bail money for Barboza on one of his many arrests. They managed to collect $59,000, which was a massive sum of money representing contributions from multiple members of the underworld. It was a show of support for one of their most effective soldiers and killers. 5 weeks later, both of those men were dead and murdered. They were killed in the Nightlight Cafe by soldiers working under Ralph Rafi Chong, La Matina. The killing was brutal and public, meant to send a clear message to everyone. Their bodies were stuffed into the back seat of Brazos' car and dumped in South Boston, where they'd be found quickly by police. This wasn't about hiding evidence or covering up a crime. It was about making a statement that everyone would see and understand. The message was perfectly clear. Joseph Barboza was getting too big, too independent, too powerful for his own good. The men around him were being systematically eliminated and removed. His support network was being destroyed piece by piece. The mob that he'd worked for, killed for, and desperately wanted to be part of, was now turning on him. But Barboza either didn't see what was happening or didn't want to believe it was real. He kept working for them, kept killing for them, kept collecting his loans from borrowers. He was convinced that his value to the organization would protect him and keep him safe. After all, he'd made them millions of dollars. He'd eliminated their enemies efficiently. He'd proven his loyalty over and over again, through blood and violence. Surely that had to count for something important. He was completely wrong about that. March 12, 1965, Chelsea, Massachusetts. Approximately 9:30 p.m., Edward Teddy Degan walks into an alley near a building on Lincoln Street. He's expecting to meet someone there, though whether it's for a business deal or a personal matter, we'll never know for certain. What we do know for certain is that Degan has been marked for death because of burglaries he committed with Stephen Flemmi. These were burglaries that brought him to the attention of people who don't forgive such transgressions and violations. Degan enters the dark alley. Multiple men are already waiting there for him. According to declassified FBI documents that were released years later, by March 19, 1965, just 7 days after the murder took place, FBI agents had already received detailed information from their informants, naming several participants in the hit, including Roy French, Ronald Casesso, Romeo Martin, and Jimmy Flemmi. Later investigations would reveal the much darker truth about what really happened. The FBI had advanced knowledge of the murder plot through their top echelon informant, Vincent Jimmy the Bear Flemmi, who was Stephen Flemmi's brother. Jimmy Flemmi was actually one of the actual shooters who killed Degan, along with Roy French and others. The FBI Bureau not only failed to prevent the killing, despite knowing in advance that Degan was targeted and marked for death, but they deliberately withheld exculpatory evidence, which means evidence that would prove innocence, in order to protect Flemmi. When Joseph Barboza became an FBI informant in 1967, he falsely testified in court that 4 innocent men, Peter Limon, Henry Tamaleo, Joseph Salvati, and Louis Greco, were involved in or ordered the Degan murder. FBI agents knew, or at the very least strongly suspected, that this testimony was perjured, which means it was lies told under oath. Yet they allowed it to stand and even coached Barboza on what to say. This led to convictions and death sentences that were later commuted when evidence emerged years later. This calculated protection of informants and deliberate suppression of truth, prioritizing intelligence sources over actual justice, would become the core of one of the greatest scandals in FBI history. 4 completely innocent men spent decades rotting in prison cells. 2 of them died behind bars for a crime they had absolutely nothing to do with. Edward Teddy Degan was the first victim in this story, but he would be far from the last victim. His murder in that Chelsea alley set in motion a chain of events that would destroy dozens of lives, expose deep FBI corruption at the highest levels, and reveal just how far federal law enforcement was willing to go to protect their sources and informants. The real tragedy of this situation is that it was all completely preventable. The FBI knew in advance that Degan was targeted for death. They could have warned him about the danger. They could have stopped it from happening. Instead, they let him walk into that alley to die because protecting their informant was deemed more valuable and important than preventing a murder from happening. And that cold calculation that one man's life was expendable and could be sacrificed for the greater goal would define absolutely everything that came after this moment. But all of that was still in the future. In March 1965, Teddy Degan was simply dead, gone forever. Just one more body in Boston's ongoing gang wars. One more family destroyed by mob violence. His widow grieved and cried. His children would grow up without a father, and in FBI offices, agents filed their paperwork and reports and protected their informants, making decisions that would echo and reverberate for decades to come. Edward Teddy Degan was the first victim in this story, but he would be very far from the last victim. His murder in that Chelsea alley set in motion a chain of terrible events that would destroy dozens of innocent lives, expose FBI corruption at the highest levels of government, and reveal just how far federal law enforcement was willing to go to protect their sources and informants. The real tragedy of this entire situation is that it was all completely preventable from the start. The FBI knew in advance that Degan was targeted and marked for death. They could have warned him about the plot. They could have prevented his murder from ever happening. Instead, they deliberately let him walk into that alley to die because protecting their informant was considered more important than protecting his life. And that decision, that cold calculation that one life was worth less than the intelligence an informant could provide to them, would define absolutely everything that came after this terrible moment. By 1966, Joseph Barboza's world was beginning to crack and fall apart around him. The signs and warnings started small at first. A car would pass too slowly by his house in Chelsea. The same faces would appear too often in too many different places. Conversations would suddenly stop when he entered rooms. For a man who'd spent his entire life reading violence in other people's eyes and sensing danger, Barboza recognized all the signs of being hunted by people who wanted him dead. Someone took a shot at him with a gun while he was standing outside his home one day. The bullet missed him, but the message was perfectly clear and unmistakable. Local authorities and police believe there were other attempts on his life that went unreported and unknown, either because Barboza handled them himself with violence, or because he didn't trust police to do anything about it to help him. The mob organization he'd worked for was turning on him completely, and the reasons were both simple and complicated at the same time. Simply put, Barboza was too violent, too unpredictable, too much of a liability and risk. The mob ran businesses, and businesses need stability and predictability to function. The animal brought only chaos wherever he went. The complicated part was this: Barboza wasn't Italian, which meant he'd never be made into an official member, which meant he had no real standing or position in the organization, which meant there was no real cost to eliminating him. He'd served his purpose well. The bodies he'd stacked up had helped the Patriarca family dominate their territory successfully. But now he was becoming a loose end, a mad dog that even his handlers couldn't control anymore. Raymond Patriarca, the boss that Barboza had killed for and enriched with his work, made the final decision when Barboza was arrested on gun charges in 1966. Patriarca refused to put up his bail money to get him out. More than that, he issued a direct order that anyone else who offered to help Barboza in any way would face serious consequences themselves. Barboza was cut off completely, abandoned by the only world he'd ever known or understood. In December 1966, Joe Amico was murdered. Amico had been part of Barboza's crew, one of his closest associates and friends. The killing was professional, efficient, and carried out by people who knew exactly what they were doing and had done it before. It was another piece of Barboza's support network being systematically eliminated. It was another message that he had no friends left on the outside anymore. After a 10-day trial in court, Barboza was sentenced to 5 years at Walpole Prison on the weapons charges. Walpole, which was officially called MCI Cedar Junction, was one of Massachusetts' toughest prisons, a brutal place where violence was routine and normal, and where mob politics played out behind bars, just like on the streets. Barboza was sent there, knowing full well that his life was in grave danger, that the Patriarca family had long reach even inside prison walls. He spent his days locked in a cell, constantly watching his back, knowing that any inmate could have been sent specifically to kill him. A shiv, which is a homemade knife. In the shower, poison hidden in his food. An accident in the prison yard. The mob had 100 different ways to reach someone, even in prison, and Barboza had absolutely no protection. Summer 1967 brought the final confirmation of what Barboza had suspected all along. Stephen Fleming, a man who'd officially supervised him for many years, sent word through channels that Gennaro Jerry Angiulo and his brothers were actively planning to murder Barboza. This wasn't speculation or paranoia on Barboza's part. It was solid fact, delivered by someone who was still inside the organization and privy to its decisions and plans. The mob had officially decided that Joseph the Animal Barboza had to die. And soon, sitting alone in his cell at Walpole, Barboza did the math and calculated his situation carefully. He was facing 5 long years inside prison, and even if he somehow managed to survive that long without being killed, he'd eventually walk out into a world where dozens of people wanted him dead. The Patriarca family wasn't going to forget about him or forgive him. They weren't going to just let it go. Every single day he continued to live was an insult to their authority, a reminder that they'd let a non-Italian get too powerful, too famous, too dangerous. He had no money left. His assets had been seized by authorities or stolen by former associates. He had no crew anymore. They were either dead or had abandoned him completely. He had no family members willing to help him. They'd all seen what happened to people who supported him. They ended up dead. He was completely alone, trapped in a concrete box, just waiting for death to come. It was in this desperate position, backed into a corner with absolutely no way out, that Joseph Barboza made the decision that would define the rest of his life and alter the entire course of FBI history forever. He decided to flip and become an informant. He decided to become a rat, which is what criminals call someone who informs on others. He decided to betray everything he'd ever believed in and everyone he'd ever worked for, all in the desperate hope that somewhere, somehow, there might be a way out of the trap he'd built for himself through 2 decades of violence and crime. But he didn't know what he was about to unleash on the world. He didn't know that the FBI agents who would soon approach him were already corrupt, already willing to sacrifice innocent lives to protect their informants, already operating in a moral gray area so dark that right and wrong had become meaningless concepts to them. Joseph Barboza thought he was making a deal to save his own life and get freedom. What he was actually doing was becoming a weapon that the FBI would use to destroy dozens of innocent people, corrupt an entire field office, and create a scandal that would reverberate and echo through law enforcement for decades to come. The animal was about to become something even worse than a killer. He was about to become an FBI informant who would lie under oath. The FBI agents who approached Joseph Barboza at Walpole Prison in late 1967 were definitely not strangers to moral compromise and bending the rules. Paul Rico and Dennis Condon had worked organized crime cases in Boston for many years. They'd built up an extensive network of informants inside the mob by offering the one thing that career criminals valued above absolutely all else: freedom from consequences for their actions. The FBI's top echelon informant program, which was conceived under Director J. Edgar Hoover, operated on a simple principle: get inside information on organized crime by recruiting criminals as informants, then protect those informants from prosecution to keep the intelligence flowing in. On paper, it made perfect sense in actual practice. It created a system where FBI agents became complicit in crimes, including murder, because protecting the informant was always the top priority above everything else. Rico and Condon sat down across from Barboza in a secure room at Walpole and made him an offer he couldn't refuse. testify against the Patriarca crime family, give up Raymond Patriarca and other high-ranking members of the organization, and the FBI would offer him immunity from prosecution for his many murders. More than that, they'd give him a completely new life in San Francisco through something called the Witness Protection Program. This was a newly created initiative that would relocate cooperating witnesses and provide them with brand new identities and lives. For Barboza, sitting in his prison cell, knowing the mob wanted him dead, the offer seemed like salvation and a miracle. It was a clean slate, a fresh start, a chance to escape the violence that had defined every single moment of his adult life. But Barboza had conditions and demands of his own. Specifically, he absolutely would not implicate his friend Vincent "Jimmy the Bear" Flemmi in any crimes whatsoever. Flemmi was one of the very few people who'd remained loyal to Barboza through everything. And despite everything he'd done and been through, the animal still had a code of loyalty to friends. He would betray the Patriarca family without hesitation. He would betray the men who turned on him. But he wouldn't betray his true friends under any circumstances. Rico and Condon agreed immediately to his condition without any hesitation. They agreed so quickly because Vincent "Jimmy the Bear" Flemmi was already their prized informant, one of the most violent and valuable sources in their entire top echelon program. Protecting him was absolutely non-negotiable, even if it meant allowing false testimony in court. So here was the actual situation. The FBI knew from Jimmy Flemmi and other sources that he was deeply involved in the Degan murder. To shield him and keep him protected, they were willing to let Barboza construct a completely false narrative, blaming other people while ensuring Jimmy's name stayed completely out of it. And they wanted to protect their informants because losing them would mean losing access to valuable intelligence on the Patriarca family. The solution they came up with? Frame innocent men for the murder instead. Use Barboza's testimony to convict them, and protect both informants in the process. Rico and Condon weren't rogue agents operating outside FBI policy on their own. They were following a pattern that had been established at the highest levels of the Bureau and government. Protect the informant first, hit the conviction second. The actual truth was secondary to those objectives. If it mattered at all, Barboza agreed to the deal in late 1967. He would testify against the Patriarca family in multiple different cases. He would point fingers, name names, tell stories that would send men to prison for decades, or even to death row to be executed. And in exchange for all this, the FBI would protect him completely, relocate him far away, and give him a real chance at a new life. But there was something the FBI agents either didn't consider or simply didn't care about. Joseph Arbosa was a diagnosed psychopath who'd spent 2 decades lying, manipulating and killing without any remorse whatsoever. They were about to give him a platform to testify in court under oath with the full backing and credibility of the FBI behind him. And they were trusting that his testimony would be truthful and honest. It wouldn't be truthful at all. Barboza saw this as a golden opportunity to settle old scores, to hurt people who'd wronged him over the years, to gain revenge against anyone he felt had disrespected him. The FBI was offering him complete immunity and asking him to talk, so he would talk plenty. He would tell them everything they wanted to hear and much more. He would weave truth and lies together so seamlessly that even he himself might not remember where one ended and the other began. The FBI agents should have known this would happen. They should have understood that a man who'd murdered at least 26 people, who'd chewed off parts of his victims' bodies, who'd built an entire empire on terror and violence, was not suddenly going to become a truth-teller simply because he was in FBI custody. But they didn't care about that. Or perhaps more accurately, they cared more about getting convictions than getting the truth. The distinction between those two things, between real justice and the appearance of justice, would prove to be absolutely catastrophic. On January 30th, 1968, someone planted a bomb in the car belonging to Barboza's attorney, John E. Fitzgerald. The explosion resulted in Fitzgerald losing his right leg below the knee in the blast. The message was perfectly clear and unmistakable. Anyone who helped Barboza in any way was a target for violence. The mob's reach extended everywhere, and their vengeance was patient and brutal and unstoppable. The FBI moved Barboza constantly after that bombing to keep him safe. They moved him to Thacker Island off the Massachusetts coast, then to Fort Devens, then to Fort Knox in Kentucky. At Fort Knox, he would walk his dog with a young FBI agent named John Norris, who would later become infamous in his own right for accepting bribes from another FBI informant, James Whitey Bulger. The pattern was already forming and taking shape. The same FBI agents, the same corrupt system, the same willingness to sacrifice everything for the sake of protecting informants and getting convictions at any cost. Barboza was patient zero in this disease, the first major case that established how far the FBI was willing to go and what they were willing to do. But for now, in early 1968, the machine was just beginning to move and gain momentum. Barboza was being carefully prepared to testify. Prosecutors were building their cases, and in Boston, innocent men were about to be arrested for a murder they didn't commit, based entirely on the testimony of a psychopath being handled by corrupt FBI agents who knew the truth but deliberately chose to hide it from everyone. The devil's bargain had been made and agreed upon. Now came the terrible consequences that would follow. May 1968, Suffolk Superior Court, Boston, Massachusetts. 6 men stand trial for the murder of Edward Teddy Degan. Their names are Peter Limon, Louis Greco, Henry Tamaleo, Ronald Casasso, Joseph Salvati, and Wilfred Roy French. The prosecution's star witness is Joseph the Animal Barboza, who takes the stand dressed in a nice suit with his hair combed neatly, looking nothing like the savage killer who'd terrorized Boston for so many years. The jury sitting in the courtroom doesn't know that Barboza himself claimed responsibility for at least 26 murders. This is a figure he boasted and bragged about, but which was never independently verified. They don't know about the man whose cheek he chewed off in a bar fight, or the piece of skull he allegedly gnawed on. They don't know that he's a diagnosed psychopath who FBI psychologists have warned is incapable of distinguishing truth from lies when it suits his purposes and goals. What they do know is that he's an FBI witness, protected and vetted by federal law enforcement. He's testifying under oath about a murder he claims to have witnessed personally. Barboza's testimony is detailed and very convincing. He describes the planning of the Dung murder in specific detail, names the participants, explains the roles each man played. He places Peter Limon, Louis Greco, Henry Tamaleo, and Ronald Casasso at the scene of the crime. He testifies that they were the shooters, that they killed Degan in cold blood in that Chelsea alley. He's lying with every single word that comes out of his mouth, but he tells it with such confidence, such specific detail and certainty, that the jury believes him completely. Why wouldn't they believe him? He's the FBI's witness. Surely the FBI wouldn't put someone on the stand who wasn't telling the truth, would they? But here's what the jury doesn't know at all, what the defense attorneys don't know, what even the prosecutors handling the case don't know. The FBI has at least 20 different descriptions of the Degan murder that directly conflict with Barboza's testimony. They have internal memos from their informants. They have surveillance reports. They have documentation that proves beyond any doubt that Barboza is lying under oath. But they share absolutely none of this critical information with the prosecutors or the defense attorneys. Louis Greco's lawyers present witnesses who testify that Greco was in Miami, Florida at the exact time of the murder. Multiple different people place him in Florida with certainty. Family members, business associates, people with no reason to lie or cover for him. But the FBI has documentation in their files proving that these witnesses are telling the complete truth. And they don't share that evidence. They deliberately let the jury believe that these witnesses are lying to provide a false alibi. Peter Limon didn't even know who Teddy Degan was as a person. He'd never met him, never heard his name mentioned, had no connection to the victim whatsoever. But Barboza testifies under oath that Limon was there at the murder, participated in the planning, and helped carry out the killing. Henry Tamaleo is a high-ranking member of the Patriarca organization, and while he's certainly a criminal involved in illegal activities, he absolutely wasn't involved in the Degan murder at all. But Barboza says he was involved, and the FBI allows this lie to stand without correction, because taking down high-ranking mob figures is the ultimate goal, and the truth is inconvenient to that goal. Ronald Casesso actually was genuinely involved in the Degan murder. He was one of the real killers, so his conviction, at least, is technically just and deserved, even if it's based entirely on perjured testimony. But then there's Joseph Salvati, and his story is particularly heartbreaking because it shows just how arbitrary and cruel Barboza's lies could be. Joseph Salvati was a small-time criminal. He had no connection to the Degan murder at all whatsoever. His only interaction with Barboza came from a $400 debt. Salvati had borrowed money from a loanshark, whose accounts were later taken over by Barboza. Unable to pay back the loan immediately, Salvati stole a baseball bat from one of Barboza's enforcers. It was a petty crime, the kind of thing that might normally result in a beating or a larger debt to pay off. Instead, just days later, Joseph Salvati was arrested for the murder of Edward Degan, a man he'd never heard of in his life, for a crime he had no involvement in whatsoever. Salvati's lawyers believed, and evidence would later confirm decades later, that Barboza set him up simply to settle an old score. Over a $400 debt and a stolen baseball bat, Barboza decided to send an innocent man to prison for life, possibly even to the electric chair to be executed. Within just days of Degan's murder, on March 12, 1965, FBI memos, some reaching all the way to Director J. Edgar Hoover himself, accurately identified the likely shooters based on informant reports. None of these memos mentioned Salvati or most of his co-defendants who were on trial. The FBI knew from day one who the real killers were, but they let the trial proceed anyway without revealing the truth. After 50 long days of testimony and deliberations, the jury returned with guilty verdicts for all 6 men. Peter Limon, Louis Greco, Henry Tamaleo, and Ronald Casesso were sentenced to death in the electric chair. Joseph Salvati and Wilfred Roy French were sentenced to life imprisonment as accessories to murder. 4 men sentenced to death, 2 men sentenced to life, for a murder that most of them didn't commit at all. Based entirely on testimony the FBI knew was false. In a trial where exculpatory evidence was deliberately withheld from the defense, Joseph Salvati stood in the courtroom and heard the judge sentence him to life in prison. He was only 34 years old at the time. He had a wife named Marie and children at home. He worked odd jobs, struggled to make ends meet, had borrowed $400 because he was desperate, and had nowhere else to turn. Now he was going to spend the rest of his entire life in prison for a murder he didn't commit. Marie Salvati sat in the courtroom and watched helplessly as her husband was being taken away in chains. She didn't know, couldn't have possibly known, that she would spend the next 30 years visiting him in prison every single Sunday, raising their children completely alone, fighting for his freedom, never wavering even once in her belief that he was innocent. Louis Greco's family heard the death sentence and collapsed in grief. Greco had been in Miami, had witnesses who saw him there, had proof of his alibi, but none of it mattered at all, because the FBI had hidden the evidence that would have cleared him completely. Peter Limon, who didn't even know who Teddy Degan was, faced execution for a murder he had no part in whatsoever. Henry Tamaleo, at 67 years old, was sentenced to die in the electric chair, and Ronald Casesso, the one man who actually was involved in the murder, faced death alongside completely innocent men. All of this happened because the FBI needed convictions and didn't care at all how they got them. In the audience, FBI agents Rico and Condon watched their plan work perfectly according to their design. They'd protected their informants, both Flemmi and Barboza. They'd gotten convictions against mob figures. The case was closed successfully. Their superiors would be very pleased with them. Joseph Arbosa received only a 1-year sentence for his cooperation with authorities, including time he'd already served. He'd confessed to multiple murders, testified in multiple trials, sent innocent men to death row. And in exchange for all of this, he'd serve less time than most people serve for petty theft. The deal was complete. The bargain had been struck and finalized, and the price would be paid in stolen years, destroyed families, and a corruption that would metastasize and spread through the FBI for decades to come. But in May 1968, as the verdicts were read aloud and the condemned men were led away in chains, none of that was clear yet to anyone, to the public, to the media, to everyone except a small handful of FBI agents and one psychopathic killer. Justice had been served properly. 6 dangerous mobsters had been convicted of murder. The streets were safer now. The system worked exactly as it should. It would be more than 30 years before the truth finally emerged into the light. And by then, some of those innocent men would already be dead, killed by the very justice system that was supposed to protect the innocent from harm. The Degan trial was just the beginning of Barboza's testimony. With the success of that prosecution, the FBI unleashed Joseph Arbosa against the entire Patriarca crime family hierarchy. He'd proven his value as a witness. Juries believed him completely. Judges trusted the FBI's vetting of him. And prosecutors loved having a witness who could speak from inside the organization with such specific, detailed knowledge. The fact that much of that knowledge was fabricated or embellished didn't seem to matter to anyone involved. On June 20th, 1968, just weeks after the Degan verdict, Raymond Patriarca himself, the boss of bosses, the man who'd controlled New England organized crime for decades, was indicted for conspiracy to murder in the 1966 killing of Providence bookmaker Willie Marfeo. The indictment was based largely on Barboza's testimony. August 9th brought another major indictment. Gennaro Jerry Angiulo, underboss of the Boston faction of the Patriarca family, was accused of participating in the murder of Rocco DiSeglio. Again, Barboza was the star witness who made the case. The FBI was systematically dismantling the Patriarca organization piece by piece, using Barboza's testimony as their primary weapon. Case after case, indictment after indictment, mob figures who'd operated with impunity for decades suddenly found themselves in courtrooms facing life sentences or death penalties. All because the animal had decided to talk and tell everything he knew. In 1970, Raymond Patriarca was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. The man who'd built an empire, who'd survived countless attempts on his life, who'd evaded law enforcement for decades, was finally brought down. But he wasn't brought down by traditional investigative work or by catching him in the act. He was brought down by the testimony of a psychopath being protected by the FBI. For the FBI, this was vindication that their strategy worked. Their strategy of using informants to penetrate organized crime was working perfectly. They were getting convictions. They were dismantling criminal enterprises. The ends justified the means in their view. But the means were corrupt, and the ends were often completely false. Shortly after Patriarca's indictment, Barboza wrote a letter to the Boston Herald newspaper. Despite everything, the violence, the betrayals, the murders, the lies, he wanted to present himself as a victim. A man who'd been forced into cooperation against his will, who just wanted peace and to be left alone. "All I want to be is left alone," he wrote in the letter. The letter was published in the newspaper, and it revealed something essential and important about Joseph Arbosa's psychology and mindset. Even after betraying everyone he'd ever worked with, even after sending innocent men to death row, even after becoming the most hated man in the entire New England underworld, he still craved attention and recognition. He still wanted to be seen as something other than what he truly was. La Cosa Nostra, the Italian-American Mafia, was willing to pay Barboza significant money to stop talking and testifying. The initial offer was $25,000, which was later raised to $50,000. For a mob that usually settled disputes and problems with bullets and violence, this was an extraordinary offer. It was proof of how much damage Barboza's testimony was causing to their organization. Barboza seriously considered the offer. He consulted with his lawyer about it. For a moment, it seemed possible that he might take the money, recant his testimony, and claim he'd been coerced or confused. The mob was offering him a fortune, and implicitly, safety. If he stopped cooperating with authorities, they might let him live. But in the end, Barboza turned down the offer. The reasons were complicated. Partly, he'd already burned so many bridges that there was no going back. The mob would never truly trust him again, payment or no payment. Partly, he'd developed a strange relationship with his FBI handlers, a dependence on them for protection and validation. And partly there was his ego. Barboza enjoyed the attention, the power that came from being able to destroy lives with his words alone. He was now the most hated man in the entire New England underworld, but he was also the most protected man. The FBI had invested too much in him to let him be killed now. They'd built multiple prosecutions on his testimony. If he died or recanted his statements, those cases could fall apart completely. So they kept him safe, moving him constantly from place to place, providing round-the-clock security, treating him like the valuable asset he'd become to them. But there was something the FBI agents didn't fully grasp or understand. Joseph Arbosa was not reforming or becoming a better person through their intervention. He wasn't becoming honest or truthful. He was still the animal, still a psychopath. Still someone for whom violence and deceit were as natural as breathing air. They were protecting a monster and calling it law enforcement. They were using a liar to establish truth in court. They were sacrificing innocent lives to convict guilty ones. And sometimes they were sacrificing innocent lives to convict other innocent ones. The machine was running smoothly and efficiently. The convictions kept coming in. And everyone involved, from the FBI agents to the prosecutors to Barboza himself, seemed to believe they were on the side of justice and doing the right thing. But real justice had left the building long ago. What remained was expedience, corruption, and a system that had learned it could function perfectly well without truth, as long as it had convictions to show. Joseph Barboza became the very first gangster ever to testify against the Mafia in a criminal trial, and as a direct result, the first man ever placed in the Federal Witness Protection Program. The program itself was brand new, created specifically to protect cooperating witnesses like Barboza from mob retaliation and revenge. The FBI set him up in Santa Rosa, California, about an hour north of San Francisco. They enrolled him in culinary school under his new identity, Joe Donati. The transformation was meant to be complete and total. New name, new location, new profession. The animal would become a cook. The man who'd murdered at least 26 people would learn to prepare meals in commercial kitchens for a living. On paper, it was a perfect fresh start. He was 3,000 miles away from Boston, from the Patriarca family, from the violence that had defined his entire existence. California in the early 1970s was experiencing a cultural renaissance. The counterculture movement, new freedoms, a sense that anything was possible for someone trying to escape their past. It seemed like the perfect place to disappear and start over. Barboza completed his culinary training successfully and got a job working in the kitchen of a freighter, which is a cargo ship. He worked on a ship that traveled up and down the Pacific coast. Later, he worked for the Rathskeller restaurant in San Francisco, a legitimate establishment where he prepared food alongside people who had absolutely no idea who he really was or what he'd done. He'd legally changed his name to Baron back in 1964, but now he was using Donati, and sometimes he would revert back to Donati, creating a confusing trail of identities that reflected the confusion of his own life. Who was he now? Not the animal anymore. That person was supposed to be left behind in Boston. Not really Joseph Barboza either. That name was too dangerous to use anywhere. He was Joe Donati now, a cook, a regular guy, just trying to live a normal and peaceful life. Except Joseph Barboza had never lived a normal life in his entire existence, and had absolutely no idea how to start doing so now. The FBI had given him money to get started in California. They'd set him up with the culinary school training, they'd found him housing, but they couldn't change who he fundamentally was as a person. They couldn't remove the violence from his personality, or the criminal instincts that had served him for decades. They'd moved him geographically across the country, but not psychologically in his mind, working in kitchens. Barboza discovered what millions of restaurant workers already know. It's extremely hard work for modest pay. The hours are long and exhausting. The heat is oppressive and unbearable. The pressure is constant and unrelenting. For a man who'd made $5,500 a week collecting loans on street corners, who'd driven a James Bond car and commanded respect through fear, this was absolutely humiliating. He was 40 years old, starting over in a profession he didn't care about at all, in a city where absolutely no one knew his name or feared it. The anonymity that was supposed to protect him and keep him safe also robbed him of the thing he'd always craved most: recognition, respect, power. Northern California in the early 1970s was absolutely beautiful. Rolling hills, wine country, the Pacific Ocean stretching to the horizon as far as you could see. But beauty doesn't fill the void where violence used to be. Paradise doesn't satisfy the needs of a man who'd built his entire identity on inspiring terror in others. Barboza lasted longer in his legitimate life than anyone had a right to expect. Almost 2 full years of honest work, of showing up to shifts on time and following orders. and living within the law. For a man with his history and background, that was almost miraculous. But could the animal really change who he was at his core? The answer, perhaps inevitably, was no later. Investigators would say they gave him a menial job. He was disgruntled and unhappy, and he immediately went back to his life of crime. It was reductive, but not inaccurate. Joseph Arbosa, working in kitchens, felt diminished and small. He saw himself as someone special, someone with skills and talents that went far beyond flipping eggs and preparing pasta dishes. He'd been powerful once. He'd been feared. Men had crossed streets just to avoid him. Now he was just another anonymous kitchen worker, ordinary and insignificant. He met a 26-year-old criminal named James Clay Wilson. Exactly how they connected isn't clear from records. Perhaps through mutual acquaintances in the Bay Area's criminal underworld. Perhaps by chance in a bar, or through some shared interest. What matters is that they recognized something in each other, some hunger for more than legitimate life could ever offer them. Together, they stole valuables worth tens of thousands of dollars. It was a significant sum that suggests they were operating at a level well beyond petty crime. Wilson's widow would later testify in court that the two men had clandestine secret meetings. They kept a stockpile of dynamite. They possessed a machine gun and other firearms. They had a bulletproof vest. And they maintained a tin box containing over $100,000 in stocks and bonds. This wasn't impulsive criminality at all. This was careful planning, organization. The accumulation of resources for larger operations they were planning. Barboza had been in California less than 3 years and had already built the foundation of a criminal enterprise. But partnerships built on crime tend to end in violence. And this one was absolutely no exception. On a walk with their wives, a detail so mundane and ordinary, it's almost absurd. Barboza got Wilson to walk away from the women for a moment. A single gunshot was heard. Barboza returned saying simply, "Okay, let's go." James Clay Wilson was dead. His wife became a widow instantly. The crime proceeds they'd accumulated together were now split one way instead of two. And Joseph Arbosa had killed again, unable to help himself, unable to resist the solution that had served him for his entire adult life. The murder happened in Santa Rosa, the same exact city where the FBI had sent Barboza to start fresh and build a new life. The investigation that followed revealed his true identity to everyone. In court, when prosecutors presented evidence about the defendant's background and history, the truth came out into the open. Joe Donati was really Joseph the Animal Barboza, the infamous Boston hitman, FBI informant, the man who testified against the Patriarca crime family. The California justice system didn't care at all about his cooperation with the FBI or his status in witness protection. They cared that he'd murdered James Clay Wilson in cold blood. In 1971, Barboza was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. The trial was covered extensively in newspapers. And suddenly everyone in California knew that the animal was living among them. The mob back in Boston certainly knew too, if there had been any doubt remaining about where Barboza was living. The California murder trial erased it completely. Barboza was convicted and sent to Folsom Prison, one of California's most notorious and toughest institutions. The same man the FBI had protected, relocated, and given a fresh start was back behind bars again, this time on the West Coast, serving time for a murder he'd committed in his supposed new life. He served 5 years at Folsom Prison. During that time, he likely encountered other criminals who knew his history, who'd heard stories about the animal from Boston. His reputation followed him even into California's prison system. Some inmates probably feared him. Others probably wanted to make a name for themselves by taking him down. But Barboza survived his time at Folsom, and in October 1975, he was paroled and released. At 43 years old, he walked out of prison for what would be the last time in his life. He was released into a world where everyone knew who he was and what he'd done. The FBI's witness protection had failed completely. The fresh start had lasted less than 3 years before he'd killed again. The idea that a man who'd murdered more than 24 people could be reformed, could be turned into a productive citizen through relocation and culinary school, had proven to be complete fantasy. Joseph Arbosa was what he'd always been, a killer incapable of change, destined to live and die in violence. And the mob in Boston, which had been patient for a decade, was about to demonstrate that they hadn't forgotten it all. Even from prison, Joseph Barboza couldn't help himself. His ego, his desperate need for attention, his desire to be relevant and important, these impulses were stronger than any sense of self-preservation. At some point during his California incarceration, Barboza made claims about having information regarding Frank Sinatra's partnership with the mob at a Massachusetts racetrack. The details were vague and unclear, the evidence completely non-existent, but Barboza presented it as if he had inside knowledge of criminal connections involving one of America's most famous entertainers. Someone took him seriously enough that the story reached congressional investigators who were looking into organized crime before proper vetting could occur. Newspapers got hold of the story and ran with it. Headlines screamed, "Sinatra linked to Mafia." Frank Sinatra had spent decades fighting accusations of mob connections. Some of those accusations had basis in fact. Sinatra had performed at mob-owned venues, had friendships with known organized crime figures, moved in circles where gangsters and celebrities mixed freely. But being friends with mobsters and being involved in mob business are very different things. And Sinatra had never been charged with any crime ever. Now, based on the word of Joseph Arbosa, a convicted murderer, proven liar, FBI informant whose testimony had already sent innocent men to death row, newspapers were suggesting Sinatra had mob ties. Sinatra was absolutely livid and furious. He demanded to speak before Congress, not as an accused man, but as a victim of slander. When he appeared before the Congressional Crime Committee, his anger was palpable and clear. "I am not a second-class citizen," Sinatra declared firmly. "Let's make that clear. How do you repair damage that has been done to my reputation by a second-class punk?" The dismissal was total and complete. A second-class punk. That's all Barboza was to Sinatra. A nobody. A criminal trying to grab headlines by dragging down famous names. And he was demanding to know how Congress planned to fix the damage done by taking Barboza's claims seriously. Barboza would later admit before the Congressional Committee that the Sinatra story was just a rumor he'd heard, nothing more than gossip. There was no evidence whatsoever, no first-hand knowledge, just gossip repeated as if it were solid fact. But the damage was done already. The headlines had run. Sinatra's reputation had taken another hit. The FBI was dismayed that their favorite informant was causing such enormous problems. They'd invested years in Barboza, protected him at enormous cost, relocated him across the country. And now he was creating scandals involving celebrities, drawing attention to himself, and by extension, drawing attention to the Witness Protection Program. But Barboza was pleased with himself. He was back in the spotlight where he wanted to be. His name was in newspapers again. People were talking about him again, even from prison, even disgraced, even exposed as a liar. he'd managed to matter. To be significant, to have impact, the incident revealed something essential about the FBI's informant program. They couldn't control their assets once they'd made deals with them. Once you make a deal with someone like Barboza, once you protect them and vouch for them and use them in court, you're stuck with whatever they do next. And if what they do next is lie about Frank Sinatra to get attention, you have to deal with the fallout. More importantly, every headline meant more people knew Joseph Arbosa was alive and living in California. The mob read newspapers too. The Sinatra incident was a gift to anyone looking for the animal. It was confirmation that he was on the West Coast, that he'd been at Folsom Prison, that he was scheduled for release. Barboza's ego had always been his greatest weakness. Now it was becoming his death sentence. October 1975, Joseph Barboza walks out of Folsom Prison a free man. He moves into a $250 a month apartment in San Francisco, using the name Joseph Donati. He's taking his alias from the identical twin brothers Richard and Robert Donati, small-time underworld figures from Boston. The name choice is interesting, suggesting that even in California, Barboza can't fully disconnect from his Boston roots. He's 3,000 miles away, but still drawing on that world for his identity. The apartment is near Ocean Beach, where the Pacific Ocean crashes against San Francisco's western shore. It's a quiet neighborhood, working class, the kind of place where people mind their own business. Barboza could disappear into the city here. Just another middle-aged man trying to get by. But disappearing isn't in his nature at all. He befriends a small-time South Boston hoodlum named James Chalmers Chagra, who's also living in the Bay Area. For Barboza, Chalmers represents a connection to home. Someone who speaks his language, understands his world. They start spending time together regularly, and Barboza confides in Chalmers about his plans. Because Joseph Barboza has big plans for his future, Joe Barboza thought San Francisco had a void of leadership when it came to organized crime. One investigator would later note, he would see if he could take over the rackets. At 43 years old, fresh out of prison, broke and infamous, Joseph Barboza was planning to build a criminal empire in San Francisco. The delusion was spectacular and incredible. He'd been convicted of murder in California. His identity was blown and known. The Boston mob wanted him dead. The FBI had stopped protecting him after his California conviction. He had no crew, no money, no connections to California's organized crime structure. But he saw opportunity where others saw obstacles. San Francisco in the mid-1970s didn't have the kind of organized crime structure that Boston did. The traditional Italian mafia had less presence on the West Coast. Maybe Barboza thought there was space for someone with his skills, his experience, his willingness to use violence. He couldn't help himself, even knowing the danger, even understanding that building a criminal enterprise would draw attention. He couldn't just live a quiet life. The violence was in him, essential to who he was. James Chalmers listened to Barboza's plans, his schemes, his dreams of building a new empire. And then Chalmers made a phone call to Boston. He contacted Gennaro Jerry Angiulo, underboss of the Boston faction of the Patriarca crime family. Angiulo was one of the men Barboza had testified against, one of the mob figures who'd seen their organization decimated by the animal's cooperation with the FBI. Chalmers told Angiulo exactly where Joseph Barboza was living. Angiulo moved quickly and decisively. He sent Capo Ilario Larry Bayan Zanino and mob soldier Joseph J. R. Russo to San Francisco with one mission: watch Chalmers' residence, wait for Barboza to visit, and when he leaves, kill him. The contract had been issued. The hitmen were in place, and Joseph Barboza, still trusting his friend Chalmers, had no idea he'd been betrayed. Zanino and Russo rented a white van and parked it on residential streets near Chalmers' apartment in San Francisco's Sunset District. They waited patiently. They watched carefully. They learned Barboza's patterns, when he visited, how long he stayed, whether he was armed. The Patriarca crime family had waited 9 long years for this opportunity. 9 years of patient planning, of keeping track of where Barboza was, of waiting for the right moment. They'd let him testify. They'd let him destroy their organization. They'd let him live in California, thinking he'd escaped. But the mob's memory was long, and their vengeance was inevitable. February 1976 arrived. San Francisco was cool, but not cold. The kind of winter weather that reminded transplanted East Coasters that they were in a different world. Barboza continued his routine, visiting Chalmers regularly, still planning his criminal comeback, still believing that he could rebuild what he'd lost. The white van idled on quiet streets. Shotguns lay across laps. And 2 men from Boston waited patiently for the animal to emerge from his friend's apartment, walk to his car, and present them with a clean shot. All that remained was patience, and patience was something the mob had in abundance. February 11th, 1976, San Francisco's Sunset District. The morning starts like any other for Joseph Arbosa. He's been out of prison for 4 months now, living in his cheap apartment near Ocean Beach, working on plans that will never come to fruition. Today, he's going to visit his friend James Chalmers, the small-time hood from South Boston who makes him feel connected to home. Barboza gets dressed, possibly checking the .38 caliber revolver he always carries. Old habits die hard. And despite being 3,000 miles from Boston, he knows better than to go anywhere unarmed. The mob has a long reach. But it's been 9 years since he testified. Maybe he's starting to believe he's actually safe. He drives to Chalmers' place in the Sunset District, one of San Francisco's quieter neighborhoods. It's residential, tree-lined streets, and modest houses. The kind of area where a white van parked at the curb wouldn't attract much attention at all. Near the corner of 25th Avenue and Moraga Street, that white van sits waiting. Inside, Joseph Russo and Ilario Zanino have been watching Chalmers' house for days now. They know Barboza is inside. They know he'll have to come out eventually. And when he does, when he walks to his car, they'll have their shot. The visit lasts maybe an hour, maybe 2. Barboza and Chalmers talk. About what? We'll never know. Does Chalmers feel guilt knowing he set up his friend? Does he avoid eye contact, find excuses to keep the visit short, or does he play it perfectly natural, laughing and reminiscing, giving Barboza no reason to suspect anything is wrong? Eventually, Barboza says his goodbyes and leaves. He walks out of Chalmers' house. Down the steps onto the sidewalk, his car is parked at the curb. It's just a short walk, maybe 30 feet. His hand is probably in his pocket, touching the .38, a reflexive gesture born from decades of paranoia. He never sees it coming. The van door slides open. Joseph Russo steps out with a shotgun. The range is close, maybe 15 feet. Barboza might have a split second of recognition. The van, the man, the weapon, but not enough time to react. 4 shotgun blasts ring out at close range. The first one hits Barboza in the torso. The impact spins him partially around. The second, third, and fourth follow in rapid succession. Each blast tears through him. The sound echoes off houses, sending birds flying from trees, making dogs bark in yards up and down the block. Joseph the animal Barboza collapses on the sidewalk, killed instantly, although armed with his .38. He never had a chance to draw it. The man who'd survived gang wars, multiple prison stints, multiple attempts on his life, who'd terrorized Boston for 2 decades, dies on a quiet San Francisco street before he can even reach for his gun. Russo and Zanino are back in the van and gone in seconds, driving calmly away from the scene, following escape routes they'd planned days earlier. By the time neighbors emerge from their houses, by the time someone calls police, by the time sirens start wailing in the distance, the killers are miles away. Police arrive to find Joseph Barboza's body on the sidewalk. Blood pooling around him, there's no mystery about what happened. This was a professional hit, execution style, the kind of murder that screams organized crime. But identifying the victim takes a moment because he's carrying ID for Joseph Donati. When they run his fingerprints and his real identity emerges, the case suddenly becomes much bigger. This isn't just a murder. This is the assassination of the FBI's star witness, the first man ever placed in witness protection, the informant whose testimony brought down the Patriarca crime family. Retired San Francisco police captain Richard Cairns would later remember, "I remember the guy got whacked. Simple, blunt, to the point. In law enforcement circles, that's all it was. A mob hit, delayed but inevitable." The animal had finally been brought down. Joseph Arbosa was 43 years old. He'd lived by violence and died by violence. In a perverse way, it was fitting. He'd shot men, stabbed men, beaten men to death. He'd terrorized an entire region, and in the end, he was killed the same way he'd killed others, quickly, brutally, without mercy. But his death wasn't an ending. In many ways, it was just another chapter in a story that would continue for decades. As the consequences of his life and his FBI-protected lies continued to ripple outward, destroying lives, exposing corruption, and revealing truths that powerful people had hoped would stay buried forever, the news of Joseph Barboza's death spread quickly through law enforcement and underworld channels. In Boston, members of the Patriarca crime family quietly celebrated. The rat who destroyed their organization, who'd sent their boss to prison, who testified against dozens of made men, was finally dead. F. Lee Bailey, a famous defense attorney who'd represented Barboza during some of his legal troubles, was quoted as saying, "Barboza's death was no great loss to society. It was a cold assessment, but not inaccurate. What positive contribution had Joseph Barboza made to the world? What value had his life added? Even his cooperation with the FBI, supposedly his redemption, had been built on lies that destroyed innocent lives. But there were others who mourned. Barboza's young daughter never recovered from her father's death, despite everything he was. Despite the monster he'd been, he was still her father. Children don't stop loving parents just because those parents are evil. She would spend her life trying to process the contradiction, the father she remembered versus the man everyone told her he was. Barboza was laid to rest in Dartmouth, Massachusetts, not far from his hometown of New Bedford. The funeral was small, attended by a handful of family members and curiosity seekers. No mob figures came to pay respects. No FBI agents showed up to honor their former informant. He was buried quickly and quietly, just another dead criminal returning to the earth. Raymond Patriarca, the boss Barboza had helped convict, was still in prison when he learned of the animal's death. One wonders what he felt. Satisfaction, certainly, but perhaps also a kind of emptiness. Patriarca had built an empire, controlled New England for decades, and all of it had been dismantled by one man's testimony. Killing Barboza didn't restore what was lost. It was revenge, but it was cold comfort. Patriarca would die of natural causes in 1984, age 76. Having served his sentence and lived his final years in relative peace, the man who'd ordered countless murders died in his bed. Surrounded by family, there's no justice in that. But there rarely is in these stories. The FBI and U.S. Marshals immediately took over the Barboza murder investigation. Captain Cairns recalled there was a lot of anxiety, a lot of worry. The first man they'd ever placed in witness protection had been assassinated. What did that mean for the program? Would other witnesses feel safe? Could the FBI protect people who testified against the mob? The families who'd been associated with Barboza, relatives, friends, people who'd helped him during his time in California, were put under protection and moved. The FBI's paranoia was understandable, but also ironic. They were scrambling to protect people connected to Barboza, while the innocent men Barboza had lied about were still rotting in prison. For Gennaro and Giulio, Barboza's death represented the end of the animal's life as a stool pigeon, and Giulio had coordinated the hit, sent the killers, arranged the logistics. It was his victory, proof that the mob's reach extended across the continent and across years. You could testify against them. You could hide in witness protection. You could change your name and move 3,000 miles away. But eventually, they'd find you. Eventually, you'd pay. The investigation into Barboza's murder would take years. But eventually evidence emerged. Ilario Zanino was later overheard on a hidden FBI bug, bragging that it was J.R. Russo who'd actually pulled the trigger. The FBI had the confession, but bringing charges was complicated. The murder had occurred in California. The killers were in Boston. Witnesses were scarce and terrified. Joseph Russo, the triggerman, would eventually be convicted in 1992 for other murders. He died in prison in 1998, age 72. Ilario Zanino died in prison in 1996 of natural causes, age 73. Gennaro Angiulo was convicted in 1986 on racketeering charges and died in 2009, age 90. Most of the men involved in Barboza's assassination lived long lives and died of old age or in prison for other crimes. The Barboza hit itself faded into history. Just one more mob murder in a century full of them. But while the story of Joseph Barboza's death reached its conclusion on that San Francisco Street in February 1976, the story of his lies, his FBI-protected testimony, and the innocent men he'd helped convict was just beginning to emerge. Because while everyone else's story was over, theirs continued year after year, decade after decade. In prison cells across Massachusetts, men who'd done nothing wrong were serving life sentences and death sentences for a murder they didn't commit. And the FBI agents who'd put them there, who'd hidden evidence and protected perjurers, were moving up through the ranks, being promoted and decorated, using the same tactics that had convicted innocent men in the Degan case on new cases with new informants. The corruption didn't die with Joseph Barboza. It metastasized and spread. February 11, 1976. While Joseph Barboza dies on a San Francisco street, Joseph Salvati is in his cell at MCI Walpole, serving year 8 of his life sentence for a murder he didn't commit. Every Sunday, his wife Marie visits. She's been coming every single week since his conviction in 1968. She brings updates about their children, about the world outside, about her continuing fight to prove his innocence. She never wavers. She never doubts. She knows her husband is innocent, and she believes, has to believe, that eventually the truth will emerge. But in 1976, that truth seems impossibly distant. Henry Tamaleo is also still in prison, now 75 years old. His death sentence was commuted when Massachusetts abolished capital punishment. But life in prison for a man his age is effectively a death sentence anyway. He's been behind bars for 11 years. Growing older, growing weaker, knowing he'll likely die here. Louis Greco is 56 years old in 1976. Serving year 8 of his sentence, he was in Miami when Teddy Degan was murdered. Witnesses testified to this. His family proved it. But none of that mattered, because the FBI hid the evidence that would have corroborated his alibi. Peter Limone is 41 years old, serving year 8. He didn't even know who Teddy Degan was. Had never met him, never heard of him, had no connection to him whatsoever. But Joseph Arbosa said he was there, and the FBI let that lie stand. These men's lives are passing in concrete boxes. Their children are growing up without fathers. Their wives are aging, visiting every week, working multiple jobs to support families alone, never giving up hope, but feeling that hope dim with each passing year. And the men in prison know something that the public doesn't know, that the FBI has successfully hidden. They're innocent. They maintain their innocence in every parole hearing, every appeal, every conversation with lawyers. But maintaining innocence is often seen as a lack of remorse. And lack of remorse means you're not eligible for parole. It's a catch-22 that traps innocent people. Admit to a crime you didn't commit and show remorse. Or maintain your innocence and stay in prison. They choose truth over freedom. They refuse to confess to murders they didn't commit. And so they stay locked up year after year, decade after decade. 1983. The Massachusetts Advisory Board of Pardons recommends that Peter Limone's sentence be commuted. It's been 15 years since his wrongful conviction. 15 years of exemplary behavior in prison. 15 years of maintaining his innocence. The board reviews his case and concludes he deserves mercy. Behind the scenes, FBI agents channel false information to the governor's office to dissuade him from granting the commutation. They feed lies, suggest Limone is more dangerous than he appears, imply that the conviction was solid. Governor Michael Dukakis denies the petition. 1984. The Advisory Board of Pardons reviews Louis Greco's case and recommends commutation. Greco has been in prison for 17 years now. He's 65 years old. His health is failing. The board believes he deserves consideration. Again, the FBI provides false information to Governor Dukakis. Again, the petition is denied. August 1985. Henry Tamaleo dies in prison of respiratory failure. He is 84 years old, the oldest prisoner in Massachusetts at the time. He spent 17 years in prison for a murder he didn't commit. He died behind bars, never vindicated, never freed. Never hearing anyone in authority admit that a terrible mistake had been made. His family buries him, knowing that he was innocent, knowing that somewhere in FBI files there's proof of that innocence. But they can't access it. They can't prove it. They can only grieve and rage at a system that stole 17 years from an innocent man and gave him nothing in return. 1986. The Advisory Board of Pardons prepares to hear Joseph Salvati's case. After the FBI provides false information again, the board rescinds its vote, approving the commutation hearing. Salvati, who's been visited by his wife every single Sunday for 18 years now, remains in prison. 1987. Louis Greco dies in prison from colon cancer and heart disease. He's been incarcerated for 27 years. His hair is white. His body is broken. He never got to see his grandchildren grow up. He never got to retire, travel, enjoy the life he'd earned through decades of work before his wrongful conviction. His family buries him next to Tamaleo, two innocent men whose graves stand as monuments to FBI corruption. 1988. Louis Greco Jr., one of Greco's sons, commits suicide by drinking a bottle of Drano. The corrosive liquid burns through his esophagus and stomach, killing him slowly and agonizingly. He leaves behind a note explaining that he can't live anymore with the pain of knowing his father died in prison innocent, with the knowledge that the system they trusted had betrayed them completely. A second-generation victim of Joseph Arbosa's lies and the FBI's corruption. A young man so destroyed by injustice that he chose one of the most painful forms of suicide imaginable. 1989. Finally, 30 years after his wrongful conviction, Joseph Salvati is released when Massachusetts Governor William Weld commutes his life sentence. Salvati is 68 years old. He spent 3 decades in prison. His wife Marie, who visited him every single Sunday for 30 years, is waiting when he walks out. They have 16 years together before Joseph Salvati dies in 2013 at age 84. 16 years of freedom after 30 years of imprisonment. 16 years to rebuild a life after 3 decades stolen by lies. But 2 men, Tamaleo and Greco, died in prison before seeing freedom. One man, Greco Jr., killed himself from the trauma. And all of them lost decades to a system that knew they were innocent and kept them locked up anyway. While Joseph Barboza lived his life in California, worked in restaurant kitchens, committed new crimes, these men sat in cells. While FBI agents were promoted and decorated for their successful prosecutions, these men grew old behind bars, while the truth sat in classified files that no one could access. These families suffered through holidays and birthdays and graduations without the men who should have been there. And every time one of these innocent men came up for parole or commutation, the FBI, knowing the truth, possessing evidence of their innocence, actively worked to keep them locked up, because if even one of them was released, if even one started asking questions and demanding answers, the whole house of cards might collapse. The FBI's precious informant program, the convictions they'd won, the reputations they'd built, all of it was constructed on lies, and they knew it. So they kept the innocent men in prison and hoped the truth would stay buried forever. December 2000, 24 years after Joseph Barboza's death, 35 years after Teddy Degan's murder, the Justice Department launches an investigation into FBI corruption, specifically examining the Bureau's use of informants in organized crime cases. It's part of a broader inquiry triggered by revelations about another FBI informant, James Whitey Bulger, who'd been protected by the same FBI agents, Paul Rico and others, who'd handled Joseph Arbosa. Investigators begin going through secret FBI informant files, documents that had been sealed and hidden for decades. What they find is explosive. The files contain information proving that the FBI had prior knowledge that Edward Degan was marked for death by FBI informants. They knew he was targeted. They knew when it would happen. They did nothing to warn or protect him. More damning, the files prove that Degan's murder was carried out by FBI informants, specifically Vincent Jimmy the Bear, Flemmy, and Joseph Barboza, and most damning of all, the files prove that 4 men known by the FBI to be innocent, Louis Greco, Peter Limon, Henry Tamaleo, and Joseph Salvati, were framed with FBI complicity. The documents are detailed, specific, undeniable. Internal FBI memos written in 1965, shortly after Degan's murder, correctly identified the actual killers. Other memos document the decision to protect those killers because they were valuable informants. Still more documents show FBI agents deliberately withholding exculpatory evidence from prosecutors and defense attorneys. It's all there in writing in official FBI files. The conspiracy, the frame-up, the decades of lies, all documented by the people who perpetrated it. January 2001. A judge overturns the convictions of Peter Limon and Joseph Salvati after the FBI documents prove their innocence. Limon is 74 years old. Salvati is 72. They've been innocent since the beginning. But only now, after more than 3 decades, does the justice system officially acknowledge it. The exoneration comes too late for Louis Greco and Henry Tamaleo, who died in prison, their innocence unrecognized. It comes too late for Louis Greco Jr., who killed himself rather than live with the injustice. It comes too late for the children who grew up without fathers, the grandchildren who never knew their grandfathers, the families who spent decades suffering. But at least the truth is finally public. At least the lies have been exposed. At least there's official acknowledgement that a terrible wrong was committed. 2003. The House Government Reform Committee releases a nearly 150-page report after a 2-year congressional investigation into FBI corruption in Boston. The report is scathing, pulling no punches in its assessment of what happened. The investigation examined the FBI's use of known murderers as informants, the Bureau's practice of shielding those informants from prosecution, and the use of perjurious testimony to knowingly convict innocent people. The report's conclusion is damning. The FBI's efforts must be considered one of the greatest failures in the history of federal law enforcement. One of the greatest failures in the history of federal law enforcement. The language is careful, bureaucratic, but the meaning is clear. The FBI didn't just make mistakes. They didn't just have bad judgment. They actively, knowingly, deliberately participated in framing innocent men for murder, then worked for decades to keep those men in prison, even as evidence of their innocence accumulated. The report details how FBI agents protected informants they knew were committing murders, withheld exculpatory evidence from prosecutors and courts, provided false information to parole boards and governors, prioritized informant protection over justice, created a culture where convictions mattered more than truth. It's not just about the Degan case. The investigation uncovers a pattern of corruption that spans decades and involves dozens of cases. The Barboza case was the template, the proof of concept that showed FBI agents they could get away with this kind of corruption. And they did get away with it for 35 years, from 1965 to 2000. The truth sat in classified files while innocent men suffered and FBI agents were promoted. The congressional report makes clear that this wasn't the work of a few rogue agents. This was systemic. Institutional corruption that went all the way to FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., J. Edgar Hoover himself had received memos accurately identifying the Degan killers within days of the murder. The corruption went to the very top, for the families of the wrongfully convicted men. The report provides vindication, everything they've been saying for decades. Every claim of innocence that was dismissed as the desperate lies of guilty men has been proven true, but vindication doesn't restore lost years. It doesn't bring back the dead. It doesn't heal trauma. It's something, but it's not enough. It will never be enough. July 26, 2007. U.S. District Court, Boston, Massachusetts. Judge Nancy Gertner, a federal judge known for her careful, thorough approach to justice, presides over the civil case brought by the families of the wrongfully convicted men. They're suing the federal government under the Federal Tort Claims Act, arguing that the FBI's actions constituted wrongful conviction and that they're entitled to damages. The case has taken years to reach this point. The government has fought it at every stage, arguing that they're immune from prosecution, that too much time has passed, that the plaintiffs can't prove FBI misconduct rose to the level of constitutional violation. But the evidence is overwhelming. The FBI's own documents prove everything. There's no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. The conspiracy is documented in black and white, in official memos, in internal communications. Judge Gertner has reviewed thousands of pages of documents. She's heard testimony from survivors, from FBI experts, from historians and legal scholars. And now she's ready to issue her ruling. The courtroom is packed. Salvati is there, now 78 years old, sitting with his wife Marie, who spent 30 years visiting him every Sunday. Limon is there, 80 years old, accompanied by family. The families of Tamaleo and Greco are represented, children and grandchildren of men who died in prison innocent. Also present are reporters, legal observers, members of the public who've followed this case for years. Everyone knows this ruling will be historic. Judge Gertner begins reading her decision. Her voice is calm but firm as she details the FBI's misconduct, the deliberate framing of innocent men, the decades of cover-up. She writes, "There can be no doubt. Suborning perjury and fabricating evidence violate the Constitution." It's a straightforward statement, almost obvious, but hearing it from a federal judge in an official ruling carries weight. The government suborned perjury. They encouraged and enabled false testimony. They fabricated evidence. They violated the Constitution. Judge Gertner continues, detailing the specific harms suffered by each plaintiff. Peter Limon, wrongfully imprisoned for 33 years. Joseph Salvati, wrongfully imprisoned for 30 years. Henry Tamaleo, who died in prison after 17 years. Louis Greco, who died in prison after 27 years. She calculates damages using a standard that plaintiffs had pointed to in earlier proceedings. Approximately $1 million for each year wrongly imprisoned. It's an attempt to quantify the unquantifiable. What's a year of your life worth? What's the value of missing your children's childhoods? Of your wife aging alone? Of your parents dying while you're locked up innocent? The mathematics are brutal. Limon, 33 years wrongfully imprisoned. Salvati, 30 years wrongfully imprisoned. Tamaleo, 17 years before death in prison. Greco, 27 years before death in prison. Plus damages for their families, for the trauma and suffering, for the loss of companionship and support. Judge Gertner announces her decision. The United States government is ordered to pay $1,017 million in damages. At the time, it's the single largest sum ever awarded from the federal government under the Federal Tort Claims Act. The amount is staggering, a number so large it makes headlines around the world. $13 million goes to Henry Tamaleo's estate, specifically to his son and wife, who'd fought for decades to clear his name. It's something, but it doesn't bring him back. It doesn't give him the years he lost. It doesn't let him die free. There are gasps in the courtroom. Some people cry Marie Salvati, who'd spent 30 years believing in her husband's innocence. Vindicated at last, but at such cost, weeps. The families of Greco and Tamaleo hold each other, grieving all over again for men who died before seeing this day. The government's lawyers sit stone-faced. They'll appeal. Of course, that's their job. But they know they'll lose. The evidence is too clear. the misconduct too egregious. Judge Gertner's ruling is scathing in its assessment of FBI behavior. She makes clear that this wasn't a mistake or an error in judgment. This was deliberate, calculated evil dressed up as law enforcement. She details how FBI agents knew who really killed Teddy Degan, actively framed innocent men, withheld evidence for decades, lied to prosecutors. Judges, governors, and parole boards prioritized protecting informants over justice, allowed innocent men to die in prison rather than admit the truth. Her ruling will become a landmark case, cited in law schools and legal textbooks as an example of institutional corruption and the limits of government immunity. For the families, the money is significant but secondary. What matters more is the official acknowledgement. The judge's words declaring that their loved ones were innocent, that the FBI was guilty, that justice, delayed by 4 decades, has finally been served. After the verdict is read, reporters swarm the families outside the courthouse. Joseph Salvati, now vindicated and compensated, speaks briefly. No amount of money can give me back those 30 years. But at least now, everyone knows the truth. At least my children and grandchildren know their father and grandfather wasn't a murderer. Peter Lamone, standing beside him, adds, I never stopped believing that the truth would come out. It took too long, and some good men died before they could see this day. But justice finally happened. The Tamaleo and Greco families release a statement. Our fathers died in prison innocent. No money will change that. But knowing that the government has officially admitted what they did, knowing that history will record the truth, that matters. That's what we fought for. The verdict is upheld on appeal. The government is forced to pay $1,017 million, divided among the families. An attempt to quantify suffering that can never truly be quantified. But more important than the money is what the case represents. Proof that even powerful institutions can be held accountable. That truth can emerge even after decades of lies. That justice, however delayed, is still possible. The story of Joseph Barboza should have been a cautionary tale that reformed the FBI's informant program. The exposure of his lies, the wrongful convictions, the decades of suffering, all of it should have led to systemic changes, new safeguards, a fundamental rethinking of how law enforcement uses criminal informants. Instead, it became a blueprint. FBI agents H. Paul Rico and Dennis Condon, Barboza's handlers, didn't face consequences for their role in framing innocent men. They weren't prosecuted. They weren't fired. They weren't even reprimanded. Instead, they continued their careers, moving up through the FBI ranks, taking on new cases, recruiting new informants, and the same pattern they'd established with Barboza: protect the informant at all costs, withhold exculpatory evidence, prioritize convictions over truth, would be repeated with other informants for decades. The most infamous example, James Whitey Bulger. Bulger was a South Boston crime boss who became an FBI informant in the 1970s, handled by the same Boston FBI office that had handled Barboza, sometimes by the same agents. The FBI allowed Bulger to continue criminal operations, including murder, while he provided information on rival criminal organizations. Bulger killed 19 people while under FBI protection. 19 murders that the FBI knew about or should have known about, committed by a man they were paying as an informant. The parallels to Barboza are striking and intentional. The FBI had learned from Barboza that protecting valuable informants, even murderous ones, was acceptable as long as it produced convictions. Stephen, the rifleman Flemmy, who'd supervised Barboza, and was himself an FBI informant during the Degan murder. Continued providing information to the FBI for decades. He was eventually convicted of 10 murders. Many committed while he was an active FBI informant, FBI agent John Morris, the same agent who'd walked Barboza's dog at Fort Knox. Later admitted to accepting bribes from Whitey Bulger. He received $7,000 in cases of wine in exchange for tipping off Bulger about investigations. Morris was granted immunity for his testimony against another corrupt FBI agent, John Connolly, who was eventually sentenced to 40 years in prison for his role in a murder committed by Bulger. The Boston FBI office became known as one of the most corrupt field offices in the country. Multiple agents were indicted for their relationships with informants. The office's entire top echelon informant program was exposed as fundamentally compromised, more focused on protecting criminals than investigating them. Other scandals followed across the country. Chicago, FBI informants committing murders while protected. New York, mob informants given approval to continue criminal enterprises. Miami, drug dealer informants allowed to continue trafficking. Los Angeles, gang member informants involved in murders. The pattern established by Barboza infected FBI operations nationwide. The top echelon informant program, conceived as a way to penetrate organized crime, became a mechanism for the FBI to become complicit in crime. Agents learned they could advance their careers by recruiting high-value informants and protecting those informants, even from murder charges, was acceptable if it led to bigger cases against bigger targets. The logic was circular and self-justifying. We need to protect this murderer so he can help us catch other murderers. We can't prosecute these crimes because then we'd lose access to information about other crimes. These innocent people need to stay in prison because admitting we framed them would undermine other cases. By 2000, when the truth about the Degan case finally emerged, the FBI had spent 35 years using the same tactics that had wrongfully convicted innocent men. Dozens of cases were potentially tainted. Hundreds of defendants had been prosecuted based on testimony from informants the FBI knew were lying. The scale of the corruption was staggering. The Barboza case was the first domino, the proof of concept that showed FBI agents they could get away with this behavior. And once that precedent was established, once agents learned that protecting informants would be rewarded while exposing corruption would be punished, the system became self-perpetuating. Joseph Arbosa died in 1976, but his legacy lived on in every corrupt informant relationship, every piece of withheld evidence, every innocent person convicted because the FBI valued convictions over truth. The system he helped create claimed countless victims beyond the men he directly lied about. It corrupted agents who might have been honest if they'd worked in a different environment. It undermined public faith in law enforcement. It proved that even institutions created to protect justice could become engines of injustice. And perhaps most tragically, it showed that sometimes the greatest failures in law enforcement don't come from not catching criminals. They come from becoming criminals themselves. In all the darkness of this story, the murders, the corruption, the wrongful convictions, there's one light that never dimmed. Marie Salvati's love for her husband. When Joseph Salvati was convicted in 1968 for a murder he didn't commit, Marie was 39 years old with children to raise, and a husband suddenly ripped from her life. The easy thing, the understandable thing, would have been to move on, divorce him, tell herself he must be guilty, because why would the FBI and prosecutors lie? Rebuild her life without him. She never considered it. I knew he was innocent, she would later say. I never doubted him for a second. Every Sunday for 30 years, Marie Salvati got dressed, got in her car, and drove to whichever prison Joseph was being held in. MCI Walpole, mostly, one of Massachusetts' toughest prisons, where the visiting rooms were depressing and the guards were often hostile, and the whole experience was designed to break your spirit. She went anyway, every single Sunday, never missed except for illness or weather so bad the prison closed to visitors. She raised their children alone, working multiple jobs to support the family. She fought for Joseph's release, writing letters to governors and parole boards, hiring lawyers, advocating at every opportunity. She saved money from her minimum wage jobs to pay for legal fees. The children grew up with Sunday visits to prison as normal. They knew their father through glass barriers and supervised visits. They celebrated Father's Days and birthdays in visiting rooms. They learned about their dad from a man in prison clothes who insisted he was innocent, backed up by a mother who never wavered. Marie watched her children graduate high school, get married, have children of their own, all milestones Joseph should have been present for, but wasn't. She watched her parents age and die. She watched friends' husbands retire and take vacations and enjoy the lives that Joseph should have been living. And every Sunday she visited. Prison visiting rooms are soul-crushing places, designed to discourage attachment. The fluorescent lights, the plastic chairs, the guards watching everything, the time limits that end conversations mid-sentence, they're meant to make you give up, to decide it's too hard, to stop coming. Marie never stopped coming in the mid-1980s. When the parole board was considering Joseph's case, Marie testified on his behalf. She brought documentation of his good behavior, letters from people who knew him, evidence of the life he'd built even in prison. The FBI secretly provided false information to the governor, and the petition was denied. Marie kept visiting in the 1990s. When new lawyers took up Joseph's case, Marie was there for every meeting, every strategy session, every court appearance. She'd become an expert on wrongful conviction law, on FBI corruption cases, on appellate procedure. She could cite case law and explain legal concepts, because she'd spent decades learning everything she could about how to free her husband. Other families of wrongfully convicted men gave up. It's not a judgment. It's understandable. 30 years is a long time. People's lives move on. But Marie's never did. Her life was on hold, waiting for Joseph to come home. 1997. Finally, after 30 years, Governor William Weld commutes Joseph's sentence. The legal battle isn't over. The conviction still stands. They're still fighting for full exoneration. But Joseph is released from prison. Marie Salvati, now 68 years old, is waiting at the prison gates when her husband walks out. She's older, grayer, worn down by 3 decades of struggle, but she's there, exactly where she promised she'd be, exactly where she'd been every Sunday for 30 years. Joseph, also 68, walks out of MCI Walpole into his wife's arms. They hold each other in the parking lot, crying, while prison guards watch and reporters take pictures and lawyers smile. It's the reunion they both dreamed of for 3 decades. They have 16 years together before Joseph dies in 2013 at age 84. 16 years of freedom after 30 years of imprisonment. 16 years to rebuild a life, to know their grandchildren, to do normal things like grocery shopping and watching TV together and sleeping in the same bed. 16 years is not enough to make up for 30. Mathematics doesn't work that way, but it's something. And Marie made it possible through sheer force of will, through refusing to give up, through love that outlasted injustice. When Joseph died in 2013, Marie was asked about those 30 years of Sunday visits, about the exhaustion and frustration and heartbreak. She said simply, "He was my husband. He was innocent. Where else would I be?" Marie Salvati represents something essential in this story of corruption and violence, the power of love and loyalty to resist institutional evil. The FBI had the power to frame innocent men, to withhold evidence, to keep people in prison for decades. But they couldn't make Marie stop visiting. They couldn't make her doubt. They couldn't break the bond between her and Joseph. In a story full of villains, Barboza, corrupt FBI agents, mob killers, Marie Salvati is unambiguously heroic. She had no power, no resources, no special skills. She was just a woman who loved her husband and refused to accept injustice. And in the end, she won. Joseph came home. The truth emerged. Their names were cleared. It took 30 years, but she won. Her story should be remembered alongside the corruption and tragedy. A reminder that even in the darkest situations, even against powerful institutions, ordinary people can make extraordinary stands for truth and love. After Joseph Barboza, the FBI didn't reform its informant program. It expanded it. The success of the Degan prosecution, despite being built on lies, encouraged the Bureau to recruit more high-value informants, offer more protection, withhold more evidence. James Whitey Bulger is the most famous example, but he's far from the only one. Bulger killed 19 people while working as an FBI informant from 1975 to 1990. 19 murders that the FBI either knew about or should have known about. His FBI handlers, including Special Agent John Connolly, protected him from prosecution, tipped him off to investigations, actively obstructed state and local law enforcement efforts to build cases against him. When other agencies tried to investigate Bulger, FBI agents interfered. When witnesses came forward, FBI agents discouraged them. When evidence accumulated, FBI agents buried it. The pattern was identical to Barboza. Protect the informant at all costs, even if it means innocent people suffer. Even if it means letting murders continue. Stephen, the rifleman Flemmy, who'd been Barboza's supervisor and was himself an informant during the Degan murder, continued working with the FBI for decades. He killed at least 10 people while under FBI protection, including his own girlfriend, Deborah Davis. In 1981, murdered because she knew too much about his relationship with law enforcement. The FBI paid Bulger and Flemmy $250,000 over the years they were informants. $250,000 in taxpayer money paid to murderers, in exchange for information that often served mainly to eliminate their criminal rivals. John Connolly, the FBI agent who handled Bulger and became closest to him, was eventually convicted of second-degree murder for his role in setting up a 1982 killing. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison, dying behind bars in 2024 at age 84. One of the few people involved in this decades-long corruption who actually faced significant consequences. Other FBI agents involved faced lesser punishments or none at all. Paul Rico, who handled both Barboza and participated in protecting other corrupt informants, was indicted for murder in 2003, but died in custody in 2004 before trial, age 78. He never faced trial for his role in the Degan frame-up. Dennis Condon, Rico's partner in handling Barboza, died in 2009 without ever being charged. Age 83. He lived his final years in peaceful retirement, never held accountable. John Morris, who walked Barboza's dog, and later took bribes from Bulger, was granted immunity in exchange for testifying against Connolly. He faced no prison time, no significant punishment. The system protected its own, while innocent men died in prison, while families were destroyed, while corruption metastasized through the FBI. The agents who enabled it mostly retired with pensions and died peacefully in their beds, but the damage they caused rippled outward. In the 1980s and 1990s, dozens of criminal cases in Boston were tainted by informant corruption. Defense attorneys filed motions in case after case, arguing that their clients had been convicted based on protected informants' perjured testimony. Some convictions were overturned. Others stood because evidence had been destroyed or witnesses had died. Multiple FBI agents from the Boston office were disciplined or forced to resign. The office itself was reorganized multiple times, trying to root out the culture of corruption that Barboza had helped establish. The Department of Justice conducted multiple investigations, producing thousands of pages of reports detailing systemic failures, corrupt relationships, and institutional rot. The reports made recommendations: better oversight, stricter rules about informant use, consequences for agents who crossed lines. Some reforms were implemented, others were ignored. And the fundamental calculus that made the Barboza case possible, that protecting valuable informants and getting convictions justifies almost any means, never really changed. Because here's the terrible truth. From the FBI's institutional perspective, the Barboza strategy worked. They took down the Patriarca crime family. They got convictions against major organized crime figures. They disrupted criminal enterprises and gathered intelligence that led to other cases. Yes, innocent men suffered. Yes, the FBI became complicit in murders. Yes, the justice system was corrupted. But organized crime in New England was significantly weakened. And isn't that what matters? This is the logic that allowed the corruption to continue. The ends, disrupting organized crime, were seen as justifying the means, protecting murderers and framing innocent people. And once an institution accepts that logic, once it decides that some injustice is acceptable in pursuit of greater justice, there's no bottom to how far it can fall. Joseph Arbosa was patient zero. He proved the concept could work. And dozens of men after him, informants and agents both, learned from his example and followed in his footsteps, creating new victims, new tragedies, new scandals. The system Barboza helped create claimed countless victims beyond those he directly lied about. Each protected informant who committed new crimes. Each piece of evidence withheld from defendants. Each innocent person convicted because protecting an informant mattered more than truth. All are part of Barboza's legacy. All casualties of a system he helped corrupt. J.R. Russo, the man who actually pulled the trigger and killed Joseph Arbosa on that San Francisco street, lived another 16 years after the assassination. He was eventually convicted in 1992 for other murders unrelated to Barboza and died in 1996 of natural causes. Age 73, he never faced charges for the Barboza killing itself. The case was too complicated, the witnesses too scattered and frightened, the evidence too circumstantial, despite the FBI bug that had captured Zanino bragging about it. Ilario Zanino, who'd accompanied Russo on the California hit, died in prison in 1996 of natural causes at age 73. He was serving time for racketeering, not murder, like Russo. He escaped specific prosecution for the Barboza killing. Gennaro Angiulo, the underboss who'd ordered Barboza's assassination, was convicted in 1986 on racketeering charges in a case that was actually legitimate, built on proper wiretaps and evidence. not protected informant's perjury. He served 24 years before his release in 2009. He died later that year, age 90, in his home surrounded by family. The man who'd orchestrated multiple murders lived to 90 and died peacefully. James Chalmers, the friend who set up Barboza for the hit, largely disappeared from public record after 1976. His exact fate is unclear. He may have been protected by the mob for his service, may have been killed to eliminate a witness, or may have simply vanished into obscurity. Sometimes people just fade away. Vincent Jimmy the Bear Flemmy, the actual killer of Teddy Degan, an FBI informant whose protection led to the framing of innocent men, died in prison in 1979 at age 57. He was serving time for other crimes, having finally been convicted after decades of FBI protection. His death in prison is the closest thing to justice any of the actual Degan killers faced. Raymond Patriarca, the mob boss Barboza testified against, served his 10-year sentence and was released. He died in 1984 at age 76 in his home in Providence. The man who'd built and controlled a criminal empire that killed dozens, who'd ordered murders including Barboza's, died of natural causes surrounded by family, having lived a full life. Ronald Casesso, one of the few men convicted for the Degan murder who actually was involved, died in prison. His death largely went unnoticed because, unlike the innocent men, his case generated no outrage or legal action. Wilfred Roy French, sentenced to life as an accessory, also died in prison. His involvement in the Degan murder remains unclear. Some evidence suggests he was present. Other evidence suggests he wasn't. But unlike the definitively innocent men, his case attracted less attention and fewer resources. The pattern is clear. Most of the people involved, the killers, the corrupt FBI agents, the mob bosses, faced little to no consequences. They lived long lives. They died of old age. They had families and retirements and peaceful endings. Meanwhile, the innocent suffered disproportionately. Henry Tomalejo, dead in prison at 84 after 17 years wrongfully imprisoned. Louis Greco, dead in prison at 75 after 27 years wrongfully imprisoned. Louis Greco Jr., suicide by drinking Drano, destroyed by his father's wrongful imprisonment. Joseph Salvati, 30 years wrongfully imprisoned, another 35 years fighting for full exoneration. Peter Lamone, 33 years wrongfully imprisoned. The families of all these men, decades of suffering, missed childhoods, lost years, trauma that passed to second and third generations. There's no justice in this accounting. The guilty mostly escaped. The innocent mostly suffered. The system that created this injustice reformed slightly, but fundamentally continued. It's tempting to want a clearer moral arc, a story where good triumphs and evil is punished. But reality rarely provides that satisfaction. Most of the FBI agents who framed innocent men retired with pensions. Most of the mobsters who killed dozens died peacefully. Most of the systems that enabled corruption continued operating. The $1,017 million verdict against the government was significant, but it came from taxpayers, not from the people actually responsible. The congressional reports were damning, but they led to limited reforms. The exposure of FBI corruption was important, but the Bureau continues using informants in similar ways. What happened to the others? Mostly, they got away with it. They lived their lives. Served some prison time maybe, but rarely faced consequences proportional to their actions. They died and were buried, and the world moved on. And most people never knew their names or their crimes. That's the hardest truth in this story. Injustice often isn't corrected. Evil often isn't punished. The innocent suffer while the guilty prosper. Systems protect themselves and their members. And by the time truth emerges, if it ever emerges, most of the people responsible are already dead. Edward Teddy Degan, the man whose murder in that Chelsea alley started everything, left behind a widow and children, while everyone else in this story, mob killers, FBI agents, wrongfully convicted men, eventually became known. The Degan family largely remained in the shadows. Teddy Degan was a small-time criminal, a burglar who made the fatal mistake of working jobs with Stephen Flemmi, who made the fatal mistake of attracting mob attention, who paid for those mistakes with his life. On March 12, 1965, his widow had to raise their children alone, not because her husband was in prison, but because he was dead, murdered in an alley by men who saw him as expendable. She had to explain to her children why their father wasn't coming home, had to struggle financially, had to rebuild a life shattered by violence. For 13 years, from 1965 to 1978, the Degan family believed that justice had been served. The men who killed Teddy, or so they thought, had been caught, tried, and convicted. 6 men were in prison for his murder. The system had worked then. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, as the truth about the Degan case emerged, the family learned something devastating. The FBI had known who really killed their husband and father from the very beginning. The FBI had protected those killers, Vincent Flemmi and Joseph Arbosa, because they were valuable informants. The FBI had let Teddy Degan walk into that alley to die. Despite having advanced knowledge that he was targeted, they could have warned him. They could have protected him. Instead, they let him be murdered because protecting their informants was more important than protecting his life. Imagine learning that 35 years after your loved one's murder, imagine discovering that the government agency tasked with preventing murders had allowed yours to happen, had known it was coming and done nothing. The Degan family received no compensation comparable to what the wrongfully convicted men received. There was no $1,017 million verdict for them. Their suffering was original. The first link in a chain of suffering that would extend for decades. But legally, they had less standing because Teddy was dead, and there was no wrongful imprisonment to compensate. They learned that the man who actually killed Teddy, Vincent "Jimmy the Bear" Flemmi, had been protected by the FBI for years after the murder, allowed to continue as an informant, paid by taxpayers, given immunity from prosecution. The man who killed their father, the killer whose identity the FBI knew within days, walked free for years while innocent men sat in prison. The children grew up fatherless, not because of bad luck or because crime is dangerous, but because FBI agents made calculated decisions that their father's life mattered less than their informant program. Those children are now in their 60s and 70s, carrying that knowledge for the rest of their lives. Edward Degan's grave is in Massachusetts, marked with a simple headstone that gives his name and dates. Nothing on it suggests the scandal his murder would trigger, the lives that would be destroyed, the corruption that would be exposed. He's the forgotten victim in a case about wrongful conviction and FBI corruption. The story's focus, understandably, is on the innocent men who were imprisoned, on Joseph Arbosa's violence and betrayals, on the systemic corruption of federal law enforcement. But Teddy Degan was murdered in an alley in 1965, and that murder was allowed to happen by people who could have prevented it. His family suffered first, before anyone else, and their suffering was never fully acknowledged or compensated in the grand narrative of the Degan case. He's often reduced to the victim, a name in police reports, a catalyst for everything that followed. But he was a person, flawed, criminal perhaps, but still human. Still someone's husband and father, still a man whose life mattered. The FBI's decision to let him die to protect their informants is, in many ways, the original sin in this story. Every other injustice flows from that decision. If the FBI had warned Degan, if they'd arrested the plotters before the murder, if they'd put justice before informant protection, none of the rest would have happened. No frame-up of innocent men, no decades of wrongful imprisonment, no corruption scandal, just one prevented murder and a lot of difficult questions about informant ethics that the FBI would have had to answer. Instead, Teddy Degan died in an alley, and his death set in motion decades of suffering for dozens of people. And his family learned 35 years later that his murder could have been prevented but wasn't, because his life was valued less than FBI intelligence gathering. They're still living with that knowledge, those children, now grandparents themselves, carrying the understanding that their father's death was policy, was strategy, was deemed acceptable collateral damage in a war on organized crime. There's no comfort in that, no closure, just the bitter knowledge that the people who were supposed to prevent murders allowed theirs to happen, then covered it up for decades. Today, if you walk through Boston's North End, you'll find trendy restaurants and boutique shops where Barboza's loansharking operations once ruled through terror. The corner of Bennington Street and Brook Street, Barboza's corner, is now part of a gentrified neighborhood where young professionals buy condos and families stroll on summer evenings. The Nightlight Cafe, where Arthur Bratzos and Thomas DePrisco were murdered and their bodies stuffed into a car, is long gone. The building has been torn down and replaced. No plaque marks the site. No historical marker explains what happened there. The blood has been washed away by time and redevelopment. MCI Walpole, where Joseph Salvati and the other wrongfully convicted men spent decades, is now called MCI Cedar Junction. It's still a maximum security prison, still houses dangerous criminals, still has the same oppressive atmosphere. But most of the inmates who were there in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s are gone now, released, transferred, or dead. The FBI's Boston office moved from its location during the Barboza era. The new building is modern, efficient, designed to project professionalism and competence. Inside, presumably, agents work legitimate cases, follow proper procedures, respect constitutional rights. The scandals of the Barboza and Bulger eras are studied as cautionary tales, lessons in what not to do. Raymond Patriarca's former territory in Providence is now history. The National Cigarette Service Company building, where he ran his empire, is just a building now, occupied by legitimate businesses. The mob that once controlled New England has been largely dismantled, broken up through legitimate prosecutions and changing times. Traditional organized crime in the region isn't gone. It never fully disappears, but it's diminished, fragmented. Nothing like the powerful structure that existed in the 1960s when Barboza was killing for them. But the scars remain. The families of the wrongfully convicted men still live in the Boston area. They still remember. Every time they pass certain locations, they are reminded. Every time someone mentions the Degan case or the FBI corruption scandals, they relive it. Marie Salvati still lives in Massachusetts. She's in her 90s now. When interviewed, she still talks about those 30 years of Sunday visits, about never doubting Joseph's innocence, about the day he finally walked free. The trauma is still there. The stolen years still hurt. But so is the pride in never giving up. The Limon family, the Greco family, the Tamaleo family, they're all still here. living their lives, carrying the history of what happened to them. The grandchildren of these men learn the story from parents who learned it from Sunday prison visits. A multi-generational trauma passed down through families. In law schools at Boston College, Harvard, and other local universities, the Degan case is taught as an example of wrongful conviction and institutional corruption. Students study Judge Gertner's ruling, debate FBI informant policies, WRITE papers about the ethical boundaries of law enforcement. The case has become academic, which is good for future lawyers, but strange for the families still living with its consequences. Occasionally, journalists write retrospectives on the anniversary of significant dates: the Degan murder, Barboza's assassination, the $1,017 million verdict. These articles remind people what happened, keep the history alive, ensure that the corruption isn't forgotten. But mostly, Boston has moved on. The city is different now, cleaner, richer, more diverse, less violent. The mob wars of the 1960s feel like ancient history to people born after 1980. The name Joseph Arbosa means nothing to most residents, even Whitey Bulger, whose case was more recent and received more media coverage, is fading from public consciousness. Walk through the North End today, and you'll see Italian restaurants, ironically, many owned by non-Italians now, tourist shops selling Boston memorabilia, families eating gelato, couples taking photos. The neighborhood that once trembled when Barboza walked its streets is now a charming destination for tourists and locals. The past is still there, though. Just beneath the surface, the buildings remember. Even if the people don't, the streets where Barboza collected his debts, where his victims were murdered, where he drove his James Bond car, they're still there, repaved and renamed perhaps, but still the same streets. And occasionally, someone old enough to remember will point to a location and say, "That's where the animal used to hold court," or "That's where they found the bodies." And younger people will look puzzled, unaware of the history, unburdened by the knowledge of what happened here. That's how it goes. Time passes, cities change, neighborhoods gentrify. The worst crimes become historical footnotes, then curiosities, then forgotten entirely. But for those who lived through it, who lost years to wrongful imprisonment or loved ones to violence, the past isn't past, it's present, always. A weight they carry every day. Boston today is beautiful, thriving, moving forward. But it's built on land where terrible things happened, where institutions failed, where innocent people suffered, and somewhere in the city, the families of those people still live, still remember, still carry scars that will never fully heal. We've spent hours now traveling through the life and death of Joseph the Animal Arbosa, through the corruption he enabled and the lives he destroyed. We've seen innocence punished and guilt rewarded, watched systems fail and institutions corrupt themselves, witnessed suffering that spans generations. So what does it all mean? What are we supposed to take away from this American tragedy? Joseph Arbosa wasn't born evil. He was born into poverty in New Bedford, Massachusetts, to immigrant parents struggling through the Great Depression. He grew up watching his boxer father's fists, feeling the sting of ethnic discrimination, learning that, in his world, violence was currency. But plenty of people grow up in poverty and violence without becoming serial killers. Plenty of Portuguese immigrants in New Bedford's tight-knit community worked hard jobs, raised families, lived honest lives despite the discrimination and hardship. So was Barboza made by his environment? Or was the violence always in him, just waiting for circumstances to release it? Perhaps it's both. Perhaps he had predispositions toward violence and psychopathy. But a different environment might have channeled differently. Or a more structured family life might have contained. Or perhaps he made choices. Dozens of small choices over years, each one moving,